So I think this is a very big claim that we're making here.
The reverse is the truth. The tribes have far less polytheism than do the civilizations. If we look at the civilizations, using history and archaeology, as we travel forward in time, polytheism increases. And as we travel backward in time, it decreases to different levels as far as we can see. Now, if any evolution scheme is correct, again, the facts present you with a major problem and they knock everything out of place.
They don't start off with so many gods. They start off with monotheism and then it degenerates into polytheism. So this is just the same methodology applied to the Indian subcontinent, and you are claiming, and others would claim that we can apply the same methodology in China, in Japan, in Africa,
absolutely.
in South America, maybe North America also. I think you've done a video on that. This is something like really fascinating, and not many people know about it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts, and today we have a very special guest who is Gerry Coghlan, and we are going to be talking about very interesting topics like original monotheism and the history of religions. So Gerry has been featured on channels like Epistemic, Aira Reroots, and also Subur Ahmed's channel. So we are delighted to have him on our platform.
How are you doing, bro? You good?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, all good, bro. All good. Top.
So can you elaborate on the topics, like what we are going to discuss today as we have planned, and how is it going to help them?
Yeah, so as you said, bro, we're basically dealing with the Quranic claim that monotheism is the original religion of mankind. That's going to be the main base of our claim. And obviously the Quran is our base for this. We have verses such as Surah Nahl, verse 36, where Allah says that He sent, or He rose up a messenger within every ummah, within every nation, saying to worship Allah and avoid the taghut, like false deities is a very rough translation of taghut. And then we have a verse in Surah Yunus, verse 19, which says, mankind was but one community, then they differed. And had it not been a word that had already gone forth from your Lord, it would have been judged between them in respect of that wherein they differ. Now, there are many more verses related to original monotheism as a whole in the Quran and the subsets, but two is enough. You get the gist, yeah?
So what are we... what are we claiming here? Monotheism is the original religion, and then it degenerates into polytheism.
Spot on.
Is that the claim?
Spot on. Claim number one, yeah.
Okay.
Monotheism was the original religion of mankind. We're going to bring some of the evidences forward for this, all from non-Muslim sources, by the way. Claim number two, that anything other than monotheism, whether you want to call it polytheism, animism, henotheism, totemism, etc., is a later development and a degeneration from the original monotheism.
And so can we add pantheism also to the list?
Yeah, of course. Of course. Okay. Anything at all other than monotheism.
Okay.
Because pantheism cannot be monotheistic by definition anyway. Even though some claim it, but that's an aside, yeah. As a third group of claims, we claim that the shirk, or the association of partners that both tribes and civilizations did with the one true God, Allah, actually matches the Quranic narrative pretty much completely. We won't go into this today, maybe in future, but it shows that how tribes and civilizations who believed in one God, when they were in real trouble, yeah, like the Quran says, when the waves are coming over them at sea and they feel real fear and dread, the worship of the jinn, the ancestors, the angels, it's all gone. The nature spirits are gone, and they start to pray to the one God via their fitrah, because they know only He can help them. We also claim that these people never put anything on the same level as Allah or as the one supreme God as they saw it, and they used to use the other beings as intercessors, which the Quran claims, and that many of the tribes, they held to the rububiyyah of the one true God, meaning His lordship, His status as creator, His status as maintainer, His status as owner, His status as the only one that gives and takes life in reality, and so on. But maybe for another episode, we can open up these topics.
Okay.
Can I
Okay.
just
So there is a
not?
lot there. Yeah. Yeah.
There is, but we'll stick to the main one for today, inshallah.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight as well what we are not claiming, by the way.
Okay.
Uh, we're not claiming that by the time the explorers, the ethnologists, or the missionaries got to the tribal cultures, that they were Muslim in the most pure sense of the word. This is just to avoid a straw man that happened to me before. I'm making it very clear now that they were polytheist, mushrikun.
Yeah.
However, they were not polytheist or mushrikun as the standard history of religions or the standard description of tribal religions says. It's a totally different story. And the second thing that we are not claiming, which I've also been strawmanned on before, is we are certainly not saying that there was a prophet on every corner of every street, in every village, in every town, in every city. We do not know the number of prophets. Allah knows best. There are different hadith with widely different numbers, none of them fully authentic. So we're not claiming to know the number of prophets. Neither are we claiming there was a prophet on every street corner, because I've been
Yeah.
strawmanned on this before as well, just to make that clear.
Okay. Okay.
I also,
So,
before,
so,
yeah,
so, so before we jump to another something which we are not claiming, I think it would be beneficial for our audiences if they are not aware what the Islamic claim is. So, like, instance, correct me if I'm wrong, but Islam is actually Islam, as we know it, it's actually a reiteration of the same message that has been repeatedly sent down to mankind throughout different times and places. And the last iteration or the reiteration is what we call the Quran, the last and final revelation. So there have been many previous revelations and prophets. We don't know how many, but Islam claims to be a monotheistic religion and the last reiteration or the last re-establishment of the same message that has been repeatedly sent down by mankind. That
spot on, spot on.
okay.
Now, I just want to say something interesting about the term which is usually translated as polytheist in the Quran. It's the word mushrik. Mushrik does not mean polytheist. Polytheist comes from two Greek words, poly meaning many and theos meaning gods. Now, if you go to one of these tribes and let's say they worshipped a small number of beings, like 4 or 5, and one was absolutely supreme, and they never put anything whatsoever on the same level as the supreme God, technically they were not polytheist, because they only believed in one God, and they didn't even call the other things gods, but they worshipped them for X, Y, and Z reason. Now, the word mushrik, it comes from the verb ashraka, which means to make a partnership or to give a share. Yeah. Now,
Okay.
what they have done is give a share of the worship due to the one true God to someone or something else. So mushrik is actually a far more accurate term for them, even though it is translated as polytheist and there is crossover, but the term the Quran uses is spot on for what these people, what they
Okay.
really did. And there's one other there's one other potentially controversial term that I'm going to use throughout the video. It is the word primitive. Okay.
Okay.
These days, this is a negative word. It has negative connotations. Because the scholars I quote from are late 1800s, early 1900s, please keep in mind the word primitive had no negative connotations back then, nor did the word savage, but I'm not going to use that word, nor did other such words that nowadays have been have taken on the meaning of insults and are derogatory. The reason I'm using it is because these scholars used it, and I want to quote them as they wrote or spoke themselves. But when I say primitive, yeah, I don't mean anything by that. I'm taking it in the signification that it would have had 100 years ago or more. Clear?
Okay. So let's Bismillah.
Okay, so
Uh,
to
so where do we
proceed
start
on,
from? Yeah.
okay, I'm going to give 3 main points that if the viewer keeps them in mind as we go on, excuse me, what I say will make a lot more sense. Yeah. First thing we're going to do is make a very rough division, and I know it's a rough division and not the most precise one. When we look at cultures of the past, we're going to call them either tribal or we're going to call them civilization. Yeah, everyone knows what those words mean, and it works perfectly for this video. And we don't need to become any more precise or technical about this. Yeah. Now, so let's say, as the evolutionists, and I mean evolution of religion, yeah, as these evolutionists claim, monotheism and eventually atheism are the final steps on an ascending ladder. Yeah, mankind has been improving biologically, mentally, in his culture, in his morals and ethics, and in his religion. Yeah, all the way up from whatever start point, simple animism, totemism, to a crude polytheism, to a more advanced polytheism, to henotheism, to monotheism, and then to their glorious achievement, their tremendous achievement of atheism. Yeah, that's the chronological order they place things in, according to necessary lines of development, according to them. Okay. Now, if we take their supposition as correct, we get whatever start point you want, tribal cultures should have far more polytheism than civilizational cultures. And the civilizations should have a far more clear monotheism, as far as we can deduce, than the tribes. Yeah? You would have an impossible task proving those two statements to be true. Utterly impossible. The reverse is the truth. The tribes have far less polytheism, and the ones who held to monotheism have a more clear and more pure conception of the one God than do the civilizations. So that's the first major problem encountered on the evolutionist paradigm. Okay. Now we go to each civilization or each type of culture separately. Yeah. If we look at the civilizations, yeah, using history and archaeology, as we travel forward in time, polytheism increases. Sometimes in places like Sumeria, Egypt, and India, to a level that you can't even classify or barely believe. Yeah. And as we travel backward in time, it decreases to different levels as far as we can see, but it always decreases at least. Sometimes lands on a clear monotheism, sometimes lands on a henotheism, but at the very least lands on a reduced polytheism. Now, if any evolutionist scheme is correct, again, the facts present you with a major problem and they knock everything out of place. Third point, within the tribal cultures, there has been a scholar called Wilhelm Schmidt and his school, and his findings were later corroborated by others as well. Basically, the method of his school was to establish ethnological ages of tribal cultures. What does that mean? Basically, to use a methodology and a framework to determine which cultures in any given particular area of the world are the closest representations of humanity's original culture. Now, you're not going to be able to go back to humanity's original culture at all, but as we go through the method, we will see that they have made a very good fist at it. And using the culture historical method, cultures which are closer to representing the original culture of humanity, lo and behold, what do we find? Even though they are widely separated by geography, they have a clear monotheism. Even if they have some shirk with it, yeah, they have a more clear and a more pure monotheism. They have less polytheism. They have higher ethics than even tribes on, say, a younger cultural level. They are strict on monogamous marriage, yeah, to the point where they will kill you if you do adultery. It's part of their codes. Yeah, incest, for example, which did crop up here and there in other tribes, is unknown amongst the ones on the older cultural level. Their prayers are very similar. They give an offering of first fruits, which is basically when the fruits of a season come, they offer them to the supreme God, not because they think he eats, as a gratitude because they know he really supplied them. Yeah. And they have even in some of their blasphemies, which we may go into in another episode, their blasphemies are similar as well, which is utterly inexplicable under the evolutionist paradigm, you know. But we'll see how some evolutionists have reacted to this evidence anyway, and we'll take it from there.
Wow, wow. So I think this is a very big claim that we're making here, which is that when we look at all of these development of cultures, development of tribes, development of civilizations, we see that they don't start off with so many gods. They start off with monotheism, and then it degenerates into polytheism, and then they also start off with some values, as you mentioned, and they have, for instance, they are very monogamous in nature. Their prayers are very much similar, and there are many similarities that we see cross culturally throughout the world, even though they did not have any kind of contact with them as far as we know.
Yeah.
They were scattered throughout the world, but we see a lot of consistency between the development of, like, in the onset of these things, and then how it degenerates into something else. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
So that's a very big claim that
Let me
they're
just
making.
add one more point on the tribal side. The polytheism and the negation of certain attributes of the supreme God and the attribution of things to him that are far below his majesty in reality also kind of match, because in another level of culture, we can see these things start to develop: the animism, the totemism, the saying the supreme God has a family and such, and the anthropomorphism. Yeah. These things
Okay.
come in on the next level of culture according to the historical culture historical method. So there is even a correlation here as well. Like we can show that the shirky stuff comes in later as well.
Wow. Wow.
But
So we are implying, that in terms of anthropomorphism, like, making God more like a human entity is
mm,
also
mm,
something that develops later. And
yes,
if we look right.
yes, yeah,
Okay.
basically. And maybe on some of the future episodes, Khalid, we will look more into the ethics regarding marriage and the first fruits offerings and such, and the flood
Wow.
stories. I forgot to mention the flood stories are, while they are different in the details, in their foundations, they are quite similar the whole world around, and they have a fall story. Like we believe man fell from his original condition in paradise due to disobedience or going near a tree, eating from a tree that Allah forbid. Again, the details of this story are different from
Wow.
location to
This,
location, but the fall story is scattered across all of these
wow. So this is
ethnologically other
really
cultures as well.
fascinating.
Yeah,
I
but we
mean,
don't have
I
time to
feel
go
like,
into that today. We don't have, but
so I,
for the future episodes, inshallah.
so I think we can make a complete series out of it. So there are
Inshallah.
so many claims out there. So, like, for example, how we call it in Islam, or the, for example, the Abrahamic faiths, that Adam and Eve, their story is also kind of seen consistently throughout
Mm,
different cultures which
mm,
had no
mm.
contact with each other. This is something
No,
really, I mean,
no.
wow. I mean, that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
So they don't use the names Adam and Eve, but
Of course, yeah.
so, but the story, the details, like I say, tend to be different, but the foundations of the story are the same. So again, inexplicable under this evolutionist paradigm, the evolution of religion. Okay, so I would encourage the viewer, if they haven't absorbed those 3 points, to just watch the last few minutes again until you absorb them, in brackets, for want of a better word. And then as you go along, things will make more sense to you if you keep these points in mind, inshallah.
Inshallah. So where do we start from? Like, for example,
Well, the
if we're
beginning.
looking at this civilization, I think we should start with the Sumerian one, because if our audience, they don't know that, if we can go back
Yeah,
in time, the first civilization that we can track, or the onset of that civilization, goes back to the Sumerian civilization.
yeah. The first example that we have right now of what would be accepted as civilization in the modern term is Sumeria. Yeah,
Okay.
the civilization dates from 4000 BC, or perhaps even farther back, depending on who you read. But it's a very ancient civilization. They have the first form of writing, as far as we know, unless we discover another one, which is unlikely. They had advanced architecture, politics, social structure, crafts, arts, social life, and everything. They had everything we have, just on a technologically lower level. So that's why I say it's the first civilization. Yeah.
Okay.
So we go to Sumeria now. Yeah. Our primary resource for this is a scholar called Stephen Langdon, who was professor of archaeology at Oxford University. And his work was published around late 1920s, 1930s. He was a specialist in Assyria and Sumeria and other Semitic cultures as well. And he was a cuneiform expert, meaning the script that was used for writing in Sumeria. This was part of his expertise. So most of what I quote from him is from a collection of books. It's called The Mythology of All Races, and he wrote the Semitic section, Semitic mythology. Some of his quotes are from other sources, and some bits and pieces I've tacked on from other sources as well, but there's no need to name them because they're a bit minor. But he's the boss in this. He's the don. So firstly, I want to show a bit of his academic honesty, because Stephen Langdon, was educated and trained by people who believed in the evolutionist school, specifically the totemism and demonism stroke magism, which is an abandoned theory now, even by the evolutionists. But the point is, as far as he was concerned, religion did evolve into monotheism, and he did not believe in revelation or scripture, and there is no sign of this guy being religious at all. Okay?
Okay.
So firstly, yeah, here is his quote. Yeah. Now, he did not know about the work of Wilhelm Schmidt, or at least he did not use it applied to the evidences of Sumeria here. It was his archaeology from him and his fellow archaeologists. So he says, and I quote now, "After long study of the Semitic and Sumerian sources, I have become convinced that totemism and demonology have nothing to do with the origins of Sumerian or Semitic religions. The former cannot be proved at all. The latter is a secondary aspect of them. I may not fail to carry conviction in concluding both in Sumerian and Semitic religions, monotheism preceded polytheism and belief in good and evil spirits. The evidence and reasons for this conclusion, so contrary to accepted and current views," let me break his quote. He knew he was going against the grain with this. He knew he was going against what was accepted of his day. So that's academic honesty and bravery, because he moved from his position based on evidence. Back to quote. "These views have been set down with care and the perception of adverse criticism." So he knew he was going to get it for this, but he still went ahead with it anyway. "It is, I trust, the conclusion of knowledge and not of audacious preconception." Okay? So he did a U-turn, from what he was taught by his teachers, and changed his position to monotheism being original just based on Sumeria before he read Wilhelm Schmidt.
So just to pull back in, so it is widely known by some people that the Sumerian civilization was more like demonic, or demonology was very prevalent there. But now we have a historian, or a bunch of historians who say that this was a later development in the
archaeologists, actually. Archaeologists.
Sorry, okay. Yeah. So we have archaeologists who say that this was a later development in the Sumerian civilization. So there was something else in the onset, or the start of that, the first time of that civilization, as far as we can track back, right?
Spot on. That's exactly what they said. Yeah. So first point about Sumeria, as I mentioned, as you go back in time chronologically in civilizations, polytheism decreases. Now let's have a little look at some excavations and their results. Yeah.
Okay.
At the height of Sumerian religion, before Sumeria, was swamped by Babylon and became Babylon and later Assyria and such, there was about 5,000 different beings worshipped. Now I have to clarify what this means. It doesn't mean that each Sumerian had a list of 5,000 gods. No. It doesn't even mean that on these 5,000 everything was considered a god. It means in one area or one temple they found 150 different beings that were being prayed to or asked for something. In another area, 200. Yeah. Another area, X amount, Y amount. Yeah. These could be ancestors, these could be saints, these could be jinn, these could be angels, or they could be the classical gods of the pantheistic pantheons, or polytheistic pantheons. Sorry, not pantheistic.
Okay.
It doesn't mean these things were gods and that every Sumerian had a list of 5,000, but somehow these people believe these entities could help them with something. Like today, you still have people praying to their ancestors and stuff, yeah? But the point is, the objects of worship, no matter what they were 5,000 before Sumeria got swamped by Babylon, okay? Now, inscriptions of roughly 3,000 BC, which were excavated, according to Langdon, show 750 gods or objects of worship. So we have a massive decrease already, okay?
Okay.
We now have a further decrease. 300 tablets excavated from Jumdet Nasser contain mention of only 3 gods. Okay? Now, I want to come back to this one after I finish with the excavations. 575 tablets excavated from Uruk in 1936 mention only 2. An, the supreme god, and Inanna, one of the major goddesses. Yeah? So we have a chronology here that decreases massively Yeah,
Wow.
as you go back, even if you stop at the 750 excavation, yeah, even if you stop there, it's still a huge decrease, but it goes back to 3 and 2. Now, there was another archaeologist from Canada called T.J. Meek who challenged Langdon. Listen to
Okay.
this.
Wow.
Because this guy was desperate to disprove monotheism as original. He challenged Langdon on the Jamdet Nasser excavation and said he erred in the number of gods. Instead of there being 3, he said there were 5 or possibly 6. So he tried to discredit him. But even if we give him the dodgy one, the maybe one, and say, yes, there was 6, you still have a colossal drop off. You
Yeah.
still have an absolutely colossal drop off. Yeah? Now, before I go to the theology of the supreme God, I'll bring a quote from another archaeologist who was Dutch and nothing to do with Langdon. Okay, his name was Henry Frankfurt. He was also an Orientalist as well.
Okay.
And from Tel Asmar excavations in the 1930s, we have artifacts dating back to 2900 BC. Yeah, and what this guy says, begin quote from Henry Frankfurt. Yeah, we possess a coherent mass of evidence derived in almost equal quantity from a temple and from the houses inhabited by those who worshipped in that temple. We are thus able to draw conclusions which the finds studied by themselves would not have made possible. For instance, we discover that on the representations of cylinder seals, which are usually connected with various gods, these can all be fitted into a consistent picture in which a single god worshipped in this temple forms the central figure. It seems, therefore, that at this early period, his various aspects were not considered separate deities in the Sumero-Akkadian pantheon.
Wow.
Now, other scholars, even Islamic scholars, have mentioned that sometimes with shirk, it's quite clear that the attributes of the supreme God were broken up and certain attributes are focused on by a particular group of people. And eventually that degenerated into a polytheism. And Henry Frankfurt agrees completely with this, based on excavations, not based on speculation, not based on an imagined framework with a bit of info here
Wow.
and a bit of info there and gaps filled in. No, all from excavations. Yeah. Nothing
Wow.
but fact.
So this is all backed up by evidence. This is not like just a theory out of like
No, these guys,
sitting
these
at
guys
the
were
armchair and making a theory out of it, but rather we have backed up by evidence and archaeologists going and excavating and then finding these things, and that is what we can see.
exactly. These guys were
So,
archaeologists. They were digging up the ground. They were trained. They were qualified. They were not theologians. And at least in their writings, they express no interest in religion whatsoever. So make of that what you will. So can we go to the theology now?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Amongst the 2 gods from the tablets excavated in Uruk, you have An. Yeah. Now, An means high or above or over the heavens, or like it has those connotations. And this was the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. Now, we don't say, just a point of aqidah, yeah, for the Muslims, we don't say An is Allah, okay? We say the concept of the supreme God, whatever it may be, when you find it in its pure form, it is a downgrade from the original Tawheed, from whenever these people or their ancestors last had a prophet. For sure, An has attributes, some attributes, which are only attributable to the one true God. But by the time the culture was analyzed, certain things were applied to him that don't fit the majesty of the one true God. Just like the Christians deify Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Obviously, we reject their divinity completely. We don't say the Christians totally disbelieve in Allah because they call him Father. We don't. But when they speak about the Father, they are talking about Allah, except their concept is corrupted. Yeah.
Yeah,
So just to
yeah,
clarify that point for the Muslims, yeah, we
yeah,
don't go farther than the Quran goes. Yeah, we don't go farther than the Quran goes. So okay, An is the highest God and the supreme God. Yeah, he's always found amongst the groupings of few deities. He is always foremost. He is the creator or begetter or father of not just mankind but all the other gods. Yeah. Langdon here brings a Sumerian word called Dinger. Dinger means, it's like Ilah. It means a god, just
wow,
a general term for God in English. When gods like Enlil or Enki are mentioned, or all the other gods, in Sumerian texts, the word Dinger is placed before them, meaning they are saying God Enki, God Enlil, Goddess Inanna, when An is mentioned, they never use this appellation. They never use this qualifier for him. They never call him Ding or An. So it's basically accepted, yeah, from this that An is the supreme God. Okay. On early, let me see now. Yes, Langdon also then speaks about pots, pottery and seals and stuff from the earliest period. He says the only pictographic religious symbol on the earliest potteries and seals and stuff is the symbol for An. It's like a pictograph, and that is the only symbol found on the pottery which is dated earliest. Yeah, they don't use the symbols for the other gods. So
Okay.
he's asking, how is this possible except that they were monotheists in the beginning? Yeah. And now he's saying, he also says that, like, even at the earliest stage, An and his worship was starting to fade into the background. This concept is known as deus atheosis. It means remote God or withdrawn God. This supports us as well, because if monotheism is more fresh and more new, the polytheistic gods or objects of worship should be fading into the background. But no, it's the worship of the supreme God that fades as we go forward in time amongst the cultures.
Wow.
The authority
So,
sorry, just let me make a few more points, inshallah.
yeah, sure.
The authority of all earthly kings comes from An. He is the one who dispenses sovereignty. The authority of the gods comes from An. Now I'm going to read from an inscription, and this is ascribed, it's quoted from the major goddess Inanna. Okay, so she wasn't just a goddess, she was one of the major ones. It says, Inanna made an offering to An and addressed a prayer to him. An, he filled the seat of honor in heaven, and Inanna announced, An, my father, I greet you. Lend your ear to my words. You have made me terrifying amongst the deities in heaven. Owing to you, my word has no rival in heaven or earth. You have given me the word missing and the chillig weapon, the antibal, and the mancium emblems. These are Sumerian words that we're not sure what they mean, but she's saying that she gets her power and her weapons and her emblems from An. And then she says, to set the socle in position and make the throne and foundation firm, to carry the might of the chitta weapon, which bends like a mubum tree, to hold the ground with the sixfold yoke, to pursue murderous raids and widespread military campaigns, to appear to those kings in the word missing of heaven like moonlight, to shoot the arrow from the arm and fall on fields, orchards, and forests like the tooth of locusts, to take the harrow to rebel lands, to remove the locks from their city gates so the doors stand open. King An, you have given me all this, and words missing, King An, and may I, word missing, probably exalt your name throughout the land like a thread. So this is obviously, it's batil because it's an inscription given to a false goddess. But the point is, according to the Sumerians, even this major goddess, she worshipped An, and her power and authority was derived from him, which is a recurrent theme in civilizations and tribes as well, even with the false objects of worship. Everything clear?
So this is quite fascinating. So if we try to pull back what we have stated up till now,
Yep.
is that if we look back into the Sumerian civilizations, we see 5,000 gods maybe, and then going back we have some evidence that it goes back to 700 gods, and then going back
Yep.
to maybe 10 or 5 or 3 or 2, and then
Yep.
one, finally there's only one god.
Yeah.
And then when we look, sorry.
No, sorry. So go ahead.
So when we look back into, for example, their theology also, we see that, for example, they refer to some god which is known as An, and all of these gods in the end are understood in a different way, and An is understood in a different way, which implies that he is the supreme. And then the main god that they have is also considered to be some kind of daughter or some kind of son or daughter of An, and then all her power she derives from An, which means that the supreme deity is An in some sense. And we can see clear development of all of these polytheistic notions with time developing, and gods increasing one by one. I mean, we can at least come to a parsimonious explanation of how it might have developed, and this makes a lot of sense with what we claim as Muslims and as Abrahamic faiths.
Of course, as we say, like amongst the polytheism, when you sift it using history archaeology, you'll find that polytheism was not like the mainstream says it is. There generally is one supreme God, and we can see aspects of his supremacy coming through, even in statements attributed to the other gods. Now, later, in a different work, Langdon amplified his earlier statement. He became even more sure of it. Yeah. So I go
Okay.
back to quoting him again. Quote: Monotheism in the Old Testament and Islamic monotheism were not the results of direct evolution from polytheism. It is a false conception of the history of religion to suppose that polytheism was necessarily connected with low types of culture. In fact, polytheism was characteristic of the greatest cultures of antiquity, but it grew out of monotheism, was only a theological interpretation of primitive monotheism. The history of Sumerian religion, which was the most powerful religious and cultural influence in the ancient world, could be traced by means of pictographic inscriptions back almost to the earliest religious concepts of man, so far as we can go. The evidence pointed unmistakably to an original monotheism. So he strengthened his stance after a few years, you know. The inscriptions and literary remains of the oldest Semitic peoples, Sumerians were not Semitic. He's talking about Arabs, yeah, and other people from the Middle East who are also Semitic, also indicate a primitive monotheism. And the totemistic origin of Hebrew and other Semitic religions has now been entirely discredited. Yeah. The evidence of anthropological studies among most primitive races still available also proves that the first concept of deity was that of a supreme being, sometimes associated with the sky or the heavens or being above, disagreed with all modern results of philologists, meaning people who study development and history of language, and decipherers of the most ancient Sumerian, Semitic, and Indo-Germanic religions. So he strengthened his earlier position as time went on. And remember, he was honest. He knew he was
Yeah.
going to get flack for doing this, but he still managed to strengthen his position as time went on. And I just want to say that I should have mentioned that I did mention how the supreme God and the attributes of supremacy and exaltedness become more muddled as civilizations go on. Yeah. Supremacy tends to shift. Like in the beginning, supremacy was given to An only. But when Sumeria got swallowed by Babylon and Acadia and later Assyria and so on and so forth, different gods were addressed as creators at different times. Yeah. Different gods were given total supremacy or partial supremacy. So the theology becomes very, very confused. Yeah. I just want to highlight some examples of this when it comes to Sumeria. Also regarding An, all the other gods are said to have received the Anutu, which means the An power. So they all derived their power from him. Yeah? Now, but the muddling of the waters comes in Babylonian and Akkadian stages, where the gods are said to have sprang from like primal waters or forces in the form of water that were not exactly personified, but it doesn't really make sense, but this is what they say. And later in the chronology of time in Babylon, even An is said to have come from the primal waters. They said he was the first of the gods, and he's still addressed as the major god mostly, not always, but he was then said to have been born, of course, after being totally supreme in the Sumerian society and more so earlier. Yeah. He's still always foremost in the lists. He later also gets equated with an actual star because his pictograph symbol was a star in the beginning. Supremacy and attribute of creation is passed from god to god in later Babylonian eras. For example, we have Namu, who is credited with being creator goddess. We have Marduk, who is credited with being creator and with supreme attributes. But at the same time, not at the same time, in another text, he's said to be the son of Enki, who's created or begotten by An and under him completely. So Marduk goes to supreme God while he's descended from the God who was created or descended from An. Yet he still manages to be somewhat or largely supreme at some stage in Babylon. He gets superseded later by a god called Nabu, who becomes supreme over Marduk. Then you have a god called Ea. Sometimes this god is called son of An, sometimes son of Tiamat, the primeval dragon. Families are given to gods, and familial relations don't stay the same. Sometimes a goddess is a wife of this god, sometimes a sister, sometimes this god is son of this god. And as you go on in time, the whole thing becomes muddled up. There's so many inconsistencies of it that you cannot make any sense of it. Now,
Okay.
key point. Yeah. For people who didn't take from archaeologists, historians, ethnologists who went deep, they stopped here. So it's kind of understandable why they would just attribute polytheism and nothing else to these cultures. But the point is, they didn't dig deep enough. Yeah. Sometimes this was due to slackness, and sometimes there was an agenda. Yeah. But the point
Okay.
is, they didn't dig deep enough. They didn't take from those who dug deep enough. Sometimes due to slackness, and sometimes because there was an agenda. So that's about it for Sumeria and Babylon. But I think what I presented was quite clear there. And none of this is based on speculation or anything. This is all based on archaeological digs and excavations and cuneiform writing on the tablets and such and such.
Wow. So if we look back, we have, like, for example, some historians who have not yet went so deep into it to actually see the kind of interconnectedness with like, these other subjects. And then there are some, as you're claiming, that which had an agenda and did not wanted to, like, make this knowledge public. Is there
Yeah.
something like that where they did not wanted to?
Basically, to make a long story short, we may do a little bit on the history of this debate in a future video. We may or may not, but it was a debate up until about the 1930s. You can say late 1800s, getting more hot in the 1930s. But after Wilhelm Schmidt published his piece on original monotheism, the evolutionist schools, some of them responded. As we see, the responses are not sufficient at all, and nothing even approaching to the standard of the work of Wilhelm Schmidt or Stephen Langdon. They're based on a priori assumptions and desires. Some responses are more technical, but those responses have also been refuted. But basically, not long after Schmidt published his work, this was just totally left alone by the evolutionists, and it's lying under the carpet, so to speak.
Okay.
And
Okay.
there's now a pile of dust on top of it, and rubbish and rubble, which has to be cleared away. So, in
Okay.
some sense, those who attributed base polytheism to Sumeria and China, etc., it's understandable. But then again, if I can find it, why can't they? And they're historians and ethnologists and so on and so forth. It just, yeah, we'll look at the ones who found it and what they said. And like I say, a lot of them didn't get to this because they weren't thorough enough. And by the way, one caveat: if you go on Wikipedia or any of these sites that you find after Googling for 10 seconds and you check the religions of such and such a tribe or such and such a civilization, you will find virtually nothing about this. And their
Okay.
information, like anytime you find information on a religion which is just a few paragraphs, I say leave it in the dirt, because it's nowhere near sufficient enough. That should be
So
obvious anyway.
yeah. So the first thing that came to my mind regarding all this was, like, as you mentioned in some sense, was that how do these evolutionists, or those who adhere to the evolutionary theory of, like, polytheism being the onset and then moving to monotheism, how do
Yeah.
they make sense of this evidence? And as you're mentioning that there's not much out there on their side, which means that we have the evidence and there is not much on their side trying to make sense of, like, the data that we have, which
No,
clearly in some sense points towards original monotheism.
they have tried to deal with it, and they have made excuses for it. It has largely been ignored, and their constructions, whether you start with animism, totemism, or any of the isms apart from monotheism, are, like I said, based on very limited data, and the stages on that ladder of ascent that mankind was supposed to be climbing up are imagined. They are exercises largely in imagination. Now, they did respond to Wilhelm Schmidt and others, and after I go through his method, which will be the next section, I'll deal with some of their responses, some general responses, and some specific ones which are a bit more technical. But either way, none of them really work, if that makes sense. So some people
Okay.
did try to respond. Some of the responses were quite frankly pathetic.
Okay.
And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean, that's the only appropriate word for them. We'll see how it goes anyway. Some were a bit better. Some were openly biased. Some were shockingly bad given the caliber of scholar who replied. But I think next we can bounce to Wilhelm Schmidt.
Sure.
And this will be a look at the methodology he used to classify the cultural ages of different tribes. Yeah. I'm not going to speak too much about the individual tribes because He wrote a massive encyclopedia on this, and we'll be here until next month if we do. But I just want to delve into his methodology a little bit. Yeah, firstly, show his caliber, show his academic honesty as well. Delve into his methodology. Very small look at the results in terms of the theology of the tribes and stuff. If people want more on that, we can bring more. Then we look at the results, critiques, and positive reviews or even U-turns, people changing their opinion based on his work. And then we'll jump to a different section, inshallah.
Inshallah. So now we are starting with Wilhelm Schmidt's method. So can we have an introduction of who we're talking about right now? Like who this guy?
Okay. For those who have not heard of him, and some may have, but he's not very well known. He's not mainstream, you could say. He's a German, born 1868, died 1955. He was a teacher at University of Vienna. He founded the Anthropos Institute, which was an institute of anthropology, which you probably gathered by the name. He was a lecturer and professor at the University of Freiburg. He wrote over 150 books and pamphlets on scientific subjects related to ethnology, linguistics, etc., and philosophy. He founded the Anthropos Society and the journal of the same name, which is an international review of ethnology and linguistics. He was a polymath, basically nothing less than a genius, specialized in many different areas. As well as being a genius, he was also a really hard worker. He stayed up late at night on a regular basis to learn native Australian languages and managed to learn many of them in a few months. This is almost unique. This is a unique achievement in history with these languages, you know. He deemed that he should not speak about a subject unless he has studied it extensively before he writes one word about it. Due to his self-drive and high standards, he often labored to the point where he had a physical breakdown and was forced to take rest.
Wow.
So we can see this guy was basically a machine when it comes to scholarship, you know. His teacher, Franz Grabner, he was basically the original person who put forward the method used to classify the tribes. It's called the culture historical method. Now, Schmidt knew when his teacher was still alive that he could improve on his method. He knew this very well, but he refused to do so, and he refused to publish anything, that improved on the culture historical method until his teacher died. So we have a level of respect here. We can see he's not just a hard worker, but he has a level of respect. He has a level of decency, human decency, you know. Lastly, and this doesn't happen unless a person is sure of their position and they are an honest academic. He openly offered and welcomed people to challenge his work. He allowed scholars who agreed with him and disagreed with him to publish in his Anthropos journal. Anyone who disagreed with him, it was a monthly journal, by the way, would without fail get a stinging reply the next month in the next edition of the journal. So he was telling people, look, come on, disagree with me if you want. And he actually moaned at one stage that the level of critique of his opponents wasn't good enough for him to learn anything from. You know, so we can see the academic caliber of the man here, you know.
Yeah.
So what did this lead to? Okay, there were people before Schmidt, again, don't have time to go into the history of this right now, but there were people before Schmidt who proposed monotheism being original and presented some evidences for it, some incorrect, but some correct and corroborated by later scholars. Then the evolutionist school, because evolution was taking hold at the time, late 1800s, early 1900s, it was working its way into academia and people were starting to become more secular, more atheistic, agnostic, etc. They published against the earlier scholars. And basically, it looked like they rinsed them. It looked like they had the better of the original monotheism proponents. Wilhelm Schmidt knew that there was a massive body of evidence for original monotheism, and he worked on gathering this, okay? Because he wanted a reply to the evolutionists, which he did, okay?
Okay.
So this resulted in, just give me a little bit more, then you can come back, inshallah. This resulted in a book which has not fully been translated into English yet, or books, I should say, a 12-volume set totaling over 11,000 pages in German called The Origin of the Idea of God. Here he lays out the case for original monotheism based on facts, based on data, and based on the cultural historical school's interpretation of the data. He does not appeal to scripture. Yeah, he doesn't hide the fact that he is Catholic, yeah, and he's a theologian. He does not appeal to scripture, and I would encourage the viewer to keep this in mind as we go along. He appeals to data and to facts, yeah. He also took apart all the other competing theories of the time. So he wrote about fetishism, he wrote about manism, he wrote about animism, he wrote about ancestor worship, he wrote about the star myth origin, he wrote about religion being a disease of language, and he smashed all these other theories as well as bringing forward the massive evidence for original monotheism. For example, there's one tribe, I believe it was the Algonquin tribes, but 80 pages of his book are devoted to data just collected on this one tribe. You know?
Wow. Wow.
So you want to interject before I go on, or?
Yeah, so basically, we like some points to note, which is that Wilhelm Schmidt is not the only one who has made this claim, and in
Not
fact it
before
takes
or
time.
after.
Yeah, so there are people who have made this claim before him also, but then
Yes.
we are referring to his work because I think he has done a very good job at it, maybe in compilation or something like that. Is that true? Like, does
Yeah.
that make sense?
We are
Am I correct?
referring to him because his work is better, more extensive, more scholarly, and based on an actual sound framework and methodology compared to those who came before him. There are also those who come after him that dealt with this topic and dove into areas that Schmidt didn't. So there are people before and after him, but no one went to anywhere near the extent that he did. That's why we reference him, basically.
Okay, and most of his work has not got the attention that it deserves, and
No,
he has always reviewed
the encyclopedic work has not been fully translated into English. It never will be. As far as from my research, you can't even get all 12 volumes in it in the same library in Germany now. So there's not a hope of it being translated into English. It's
Okay.
also over 11,000 pages. So good luck to anyone who wants to do that. They'll be here until God knows when. But scholars complained about the size of his book and how technical it was. So he wrote a lesser book containing all the main points called The Origin and Growth of Religion by Wilhelm Schmidt. This has been translated into English. So all the
Okay.
main points have been, and some of the bigger stuff has been, but not much. Now,
So also another interesting point is that this is at the same time of when these evolutionary theories were also kind of competing, and he's the one who's already refuted most of the, like, these evolutionary theories and some of the development in that area.
yeah,
But now what we see prevalent in our times is just those evolutionary theories, and this is something not very well known to the masses.
okay.
And
Let me jump in there and make a point that I really should make. Good job, you've reminded me of it indirectly. Nowadays, anthropologists have given up the search for the origin of religion. They say we cannot know its origin. Okay,
okay,
officially, that is the modern position. However, when they speak about earlier or more ancient religions, it always slants towards animism or totemism, or to a lesser extent, the ancestor worship. They never slant towards original monotheism, even though, yeah, Schmidt is the only one that came with a solid and testable methodology and framework for his theory. Yeah, even though they
okay.
say, just to make clear, they have abandoned the search for origins in anthropology now. Allah knows best why, what their intentions are, etc. But like I say, it says a lot that they always slant towards the animistic evolutionist side, even though they've apparently abandoned searches for origins. When they talk about earlier incarnations of religion, that's where they go.
Wow. So this is another point to note, which is that this hypothesis, this theory is not even actually accepted as a hypothesis now, and only theories like animism and these kind of were the start of, like, this is how humanity started, is kind of focused upon. But we see that most of the evidence kind of points to the opposite direction, which makes more sense that monotheism was like the first religion of mankind, or what humans had, and then later on developed into different
Yeah.
uh,
When we
later on
open up,
developed into
sorry.
animism and stuff like that. This is again interesting that this is not even considered as a competing theory or a competing
No, it's
competing
in it's
paradigm.
it's in the dustbin of anthropology for most anthropologists. There are some that have tried to bring it back in modern times, and we can go into that in another video. There are some. It's say 99.9% have relegated it to the dustbin. Okay, and
Okay.
they've
Okay.
abandoned the search for origins. Why? Because if monotheism is found to be prevalent and primal amongst the culturally oldest peoples, then using Occam's razor, we say that it's most likely that God did have something to do with the revelation or the knowledge of God in these earlier peoples.
Wow.
Of course,
Wow.
that blows the evolutionary theories into smithereens. But anyway,
Wow. So just one more point I would like to note is that if we consider the original monotheistic theory, and it makes sense of the data also, but then it also has some implications about other things,
oh
right?
yes,
And that could be a problem for someone who is trying to look at everything from a secular
yeah,
perspective, because those implications would be a problem to be explained in in,
mm, mm,
in those
mm, mm,
disciplines, I believe.
mm. Yeah, you can roughly equate it to naturalism in the physical sciences. If you've already set yourself a boundary of atheism, stroke secularism, stroke godlessness, then you cannot accept original monotheism because you're in Syria. You've just taken a bulldozer and ripped out the foundations of your own house, and
Exactly.
it's now crumbling down on top of you. And no one wants to
Okay.
do that, do they?
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
So it can be also like our people's materialistic a priori assumptions about reality, or their metaphysics, or their philosophical assumptions or ontological worldview. I mean, I'm using a lot of terms, but what I'm
Yeah, 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 yeah.
trying to say is that their primary assumptions about reality also dictates in some sense, like how they would interpret the data, and
Yes,
that could
absolutely.
and then this kind of evidence is going to be a problem, because it kind of fits better in a metaphysical worldview, which is more like theistic worldview, or theistic or
Yes,
monotheistic
yes,
worldview.
exactly.
Okay.
Anyway, this will become more clear as we go on. So, what was the culture historical method for?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So
let's talk about what
let's come to
for.
the crux of the matter. Yeah.
So Schmidt said that obviously civilizations have a written and an archaeological history. Yeah, but he said that tribal cultures, and I want to reiterate that I know it's a very rough division, but it works for the purposes. Okay, he said that tribal cultures also have a history, except they did not write it down. Okay, so he said that. Hold on a minute. Okay, so using this method, what he was trying to do was to attempt to establish chronological ages. I know it's a bit. Well, we wrote this. He was trying to attempt to establish chronological ages of different cultures to see which cultures were younger and which cultures were older. Older corresponding more to or more closely to how mankind were before they split up and spread across the earth. Okay. Now, it sounds like a huge thing to do, and it was. It took him decades. The book he wrote took him decades, yeah, over 3 decades, as far as I know, which again shows how staunch and hardworking he was. They also analyzed these cultures' relations to each other in any given area, did not use revelation as a source of their data, okay? And they ended up with four main divisions of cultures. We're going to focus on one, the ethnologically oldest. The divisions
Okay.
were primitive, and I've already qualified why I'm using that word. If you haven't watched the start of the video, please do go back. Primitive, primary, secondary, and tertiary, which basically just mean first, second, and third in different language. We are going to focus on the primitive because they are the ethnologically oldest cultures according to the culture historical method. And that's what we want to do. Go back in time to see what was primal. Was it monotheism or anything else? Okay. Um, yeah, so just before I go on with the Wilhelm Schmidt method, his opponents rallied against original monotheism because it violated so-called fixed laws of development. Yeah, for them, mankind was evolving in every single way. Therefore, he had to be improving in every single way, slowly, but still improving culturally, religiously, physically, mentally, so on and so forth. Now, I must clarify Schmidt and his school did not say there were fixed laws of development. If you imagine any evolutionist paradigm as mankind going like this up, 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 according to fixed laws of development, which had to happen. Schmidt did not say that mankind went down, 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 down. Basically, he's saying this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened, and that happened, and mankind went this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, this way. He's not proposing fixed lines going one way. He's just establishing an unwritten history, and we'll see how. But the point is, some of his opponents accused him of falling into an evolutionary framework as well, but he didn't, because he said there was nothing fixed about the development, the degeneration, the uplifting of the cultures, etc. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's one shubahat that we'll take out in more detail later.
So we can stand. So if I got that correctly, it could be like, for example, some civilization degenerated into, for example, animism, and some civilization can degenerate into henotheism or pantheism or something like that. It's not like a proper fixed development for all of them. They can be a bit different with their developments, right?
The point E.B. Tyler, who was the founder of the animism school, was saying cultures had to have passed through the animistic stage. Then they went on according to his framework. Herbert Spencer said he agreed with Tyler, but he said no, there was a stage before animism. These are British anthropologists. He said ancestor worship was before. Although he agreed with Tyler, he didn't agree it was original. He said cultures must have passed through ancestor worship. And then on according to his framework, which was different. But Schmidt didn't say they must have. For him, they could have passed to animism. Then, for example, revelation could have come, or a prophet could have come, although he wasn't too big on this. And then they may have went back to monotheism. They may have slid into another form of polytheism, or they may have just degenerated from monotheism into this polytheism. But there's nothing fixed about his laws of development. He's just reading things as they happened. And he's not producing fixed line of development going upward or in any other way. He's just identifying the cultural ages of different peoples around the world. Is that clear?
Okay, I get it. And it makes more sense with our worldview or the Islamic framework, which is that, for example, if a culture is also degenerating into polytheism, there can be another prophet or another revelation sent back to them. And then, that can again establish monotheism in their own.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean they accept the prophet, because we know prophets were rejected en masse. Some prophets had no followers, but it doesn't mean they accepted the prophet, but the prophet could have been there. They could have accepted. Some of them could have accepted. Some may have rejected, so on and so forth. So it does fit with our narrative. Yes, it does. You're correct.
Yeah.
So basically, when it comes to sample size of data, Wilhelm Schmidt used a much greater sample size than any of the evolutionist schools. The fact that he took 30 years to complete his work implies that anyway. This is one of the most extensive research projects ever done by one man, if not the most. I have no way to verify that. So the evolutionist schools, working with smaller samples, tended to interpret various rituals, often colorful and filled with various different symbolisms, as the sum total of the tribe's belief and religious creeds. Now, here's the key. To actually get into the proper beliefs of the tribes, you had to have generally stayed with them for a long time, learn not just their language, learn their lore, learn their culture, befriended them, and got their trust. And we'll go into this in future videos, but the point is, Schmidt, the people he analyzed, did this. Whereas the evolutionist schools, E.B. Tyler, Herbert Spencer, the people they took data from, because they weren't with the tribes themselves, were on more of the shabby, slack side of things, and that a lot of them didn't spend too long with the tribes. Like Darwin is an actual example on himself, and we'll open him up in a later video, inshallah. They didn't learn the language properly. The only idea they had of religion was Western Christianity. So they see these people doing elaborate rituals and whatnot, and then they start building the animistic framework off the back of the data of the people who interpreted the rituals and so on and so forth. But the people who did more painstaking investigations after gaining confidence of the tribes, basically befriending them, almost always uncovered a higher level of religious thought. A cosmogony that included a creator and sustainer who could not be pictured, sculptured, or pantomimed by a human actor. In many cases, valid prayers were offered to the Supreme Being, And as such field investigation increased, so did the number of tribes believing in the existence of a high God. Now, that is to different extents and different emphases, depending on which tribe is analyzed. But it's generally there all around the world. I'm not saying every single tribe had it. Some of the tribes who were culturally younger had lost it, and some who were a bit more older had the conception of a supreme God, but he was Deus Atheosis, remote God, only prayed to in times of real trouble, which backs us up as well. Yeah, and
Okay.
like I said earlier, the remote God phenomenon backs us up as well. Because if the supreme God was a later addition, he would be at the forefront, and the jinn and the
Right.
angels and the ancestors would be gone into the back. So how come they're at the forefront if they're earlier, and the supreme God is a later accretion? So okay, after the four groupings, yeah, each of those had subgroupings as well, but there's no need to go into this. Just want to show that he did go into a lot of detail. He establishes the age, the cultural or the ethnological age of tribes via four main criteria. Number one, location. Okay. The tribes who fall under the primitive bracket or the culturally older are almost always in deep forests that are hard to access. They're on islands. They're on the southern tip of South America. And when I say the southern tip, I mean the absolute tip. They're on the other edges of continents. They're in the Arctic, or they're behind hard to pass mountain ranges. So they are in locations, which means they don't have contact with other cultures. So once they get there, diffusion doesn't occur. It may have occurred before and it would have along the way, but it doesn't occur. Second point, not the main point, but related to this, is the locations they're in show no evidence of have being inhabited before these tribes. Okay, so they were the first inhabitants, indigenous, if you like. How did they end up there? It's basically theorized by Schmidt and other anthropologists, ethnologists, that they got pushed by more advanced cultures out of one area, yeah, then pushed again, and then pushed again until they basically retreated behind a difficult to pass mountain or into a deep, dense forest or onto an island. Otherwise, why on earth would you go there? So these people did not have time to settle, yeah, get diffusions of other cultures, add this, add that, take on board this, and start building up to a civilization. No, because they were on the move, their cultural level, although we can't say it's exactly like the primal cultural level of mankind, that's an outrageous claim, it will still be more closer. Yeah, given their location and how they ended up there, and the fact that they were the first inhabitants of the locations. Yeah. I'm going to now throw in a few names of the tribes. Again, there's no need to name them all because multiplying examples is pointless if you just give a few. Yeah. We have the Pygmy tribe, who are situated in the Congo Basin, West Central Africa. We have the Tierra del Fuegians, who are on the southern tip of South America. And we have a great refutation of them being savages, by the way, maybe in a future episode, inshallah. We have a number of tribes from southeastern Australia, the Kurnai, the Kulin, and the Yuin. We have the Andaman Islanders, who are situated on Sentinel Island, I believe it's called, in the Bay of Bengal. We have the Yuki, who are a North Californian tribe. We have the Algonquin Native Americans spread over Canada and northeast of America, east central. And we have the Inland Salish on the northwest. There are many others as well, but there's no point to read off more examples, just to give you the names of some of the tribes considered in the primitive level by Schmidt and his team. Yeah. Everything clear so far?
Yeah. So basically, we're talking about all the primitive tribes that are scattered all across the world, and that
Yeah.
includes maybe, for example, some tribes from Congo, as you mentioned, the
Yeah.
Pygmies,
Yeah.
and then there are some from North America, and
Yeah.
all across the globe, and
Yeah.
and Wilhelm Schmidt and his team had to
Yeah.
collect the data all across the world where they could find the primitive
Yeah.
tribes, the tribes that could go back to living the ways that the most primitive mankind used to live, the lifestyle and stuff like that, and trying to
Yeah.
investigate what their beliefs were. And this is what we have come so far.
Exactly. So that's just their location. I mean, it's common sense that if they are driven into those locations, that they don't have a chance to change their culture much. It would have changed as they moved and stuff and got displaced, but it's just common sense. So Second method that his team used, and these methods go a lot deeper than I expound on here. I'm just giving you the basics here. But
Okay.
number two, uh, which method they used to establish the primacy of culture was how they attained their sustenance. Okay, how they fed themselves, basically. All of these cultures are hunter gatherers. Okay, they have not developed farming or breeding of animals to slaughter for meat or any pastoral pursuit. They don't till the land, they don't sow crops, yeah, they don't breed chickens, they don't breed cows, they don't breed anything. They gather their veg, their herbs, their fruits, and whatnot, and they go hunting for meat.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, you're on a very simple level of sustenance acquisition or food acquisition, you could say. Yeah. Just like they're pushed into the farthest corners of the world geographically, they're still on a very simple level of
Okay.
means of gathering their food. You with me?
Yeah, I'm with you. So now we are talking about, so now this is very common, like, many people, they, whenever they point to mankind or something that we have developed, they always go back to the hunter gatherers, and how they live. Now
Yeah.
now we have examples of the hunter gatherer civilizations or hunter gatherer tribes all across the
Mhm.
world, and what kind of belief they are with. So this would give us more insight on how things have developed.
Yeah. And if we can stick point one to point two, it just so happens that the people in these widely dispersed areas are hunter gatherers as well. So it's point two strengthens point one. Points three and four are quite similar. Point three expands on basically what they do for life essentials. Yeah, they only have the most simple housing, the most simple clothing, and the most simple tools and weapons. Yeah, they have the most simple tools and weapons ever discovered, and even compared to the tribes who are on the primary level, yeah, they are less advanced. And point
Okay.
four relates to non-essential cultural activities which they don't have, like weaving, pottery, metalwork, which can be essential as well, but can also be done for decoration. They don't have any hunting methods. They don't have mother right succession. The lineage passes through the father. They don't have cattle breeding, etc., etc. Now, all of these are observed in the more advanced cultures, but not in the ones on the primitive level. Yeah. So Schmidt concludes, and obviously I've only spoken about this for a few minutes. He has a book which is over 11,000 pages, so I've literally only scratched the surface, if even that. But Schmidt concludes, and others as well before and after, that these peoples and therefore their religions belong ethnologically or culturally to the most ancient period. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's all
So
common
so
sense anyway.
yeah, I mean, that's common sense. And if we look at it, like, the more complexity we see in the ways of life, and how people are living in, we can ascribe that, it has advanced in some sense, and that would be the most parsimonious explanation. So so I think from a very simple minded perspective, if I look at it if I look at this perspective, so the more simple people are, the, like, not having complexities in their way of life, like, living, having their foods, and their homes and stuff. The more simple we go back to,
Mm.
we get to know, like, we have these levels, like, the primitive, primary, secondary, tertiary, if I'm not wrong. So if
Yeah.
you looking at the hunter gatherers, the primitive people, and their beliefs, if that is more inclined towards monotheism, it makes more sense that, any which way it makes more sense that monotheism is more simple than all these polytheisms and pantheism and these kind of complexities. So it makes sense that, simple people would have a simple belief, which is monotheism. So
Mm.
I mean,
Mm.
from a very simple minded perspective, I think it all fits in the bus quite well.
Yeah, and of course, look, if the anti-evolutionist school is taken as true, these people should be the foremost in polytheism of every kind. Yeah, but when we look at their beliefs, we find that this is not the case. Yeah, going back to the tribes I've just mentioned and others, the ones on the primitive level, they have a far more clear picture of the supreme being than any civilization. Yeah, so the attributes that we would term rububiyah, creation, ownership, maintenance, management, taking of life and death, exaltedness, highness, etc. They all have these for the Supreme Being clearly. And even though they may worship other beings, they are much fewer. There's much fewer objects of worship in their cultures. They never put them on the same level as the supreme being. Okay.
Wow.
Not only do they have the rububiyya attributes, yeah, they have the ethical and moral attributes as well, like mercy, compassion, benevolence, giving, provision, also all attributed to the supreme being in these cultures. Yeah.
Wow.
And their ethics, yeah, in these widely distributed cultures, they say, when asked where they got their ethics from, they say they were given to their ancestors or the primal pair or the first progenitors of their particular tribe by the supreme being long ago in the past. So they attribute their ethics to the supreme being as well. Yeah.
Okay,
And
so they're getting their moral framework also from this entity which
yeah,
they are
and
assigned to.
all of this is from decades of collected data from Wilhelm Schmidt, by the way.
Wow.
It's like I'm only touching on it briefly, and we
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
have we can't go into it too deeply. But if anyone wants to, they can buy The Origin and Growth of Religion by Wilhelm Schmidt. It's a summarized book. Like I said, it's a summary of the larger book, but it's still very technical. It's a very dry read, but it shows his caliber and shows the fact that like he wasn't speaking theologically here, although he was a Catholic. He was speaking from an academic perspective. Yeah. Now, worship of the supreme being, when you even come to the primary cultures who are on the second level, it's basically disappeared, except just like the Quran says it is, when they are in real trouble, when there's a drought,
Wow.
when
Okay.
they're being attacked, when there's famine, when there's this, that, the other thing, then all of a sudden it comes back in that particular instance. Yeah. And when they get what they want, or not, as the case may be, boom, they're back to the multiplicity of shirk or polytheism. Yeah. However, in the primary cultures, prayers are addressed to the supreme being on a daily basis. Yeah. Prayers are generally, like Allah says, mushrikun, they generally pray for the dunya. These prayers are dunya focused prayers, but they are generally for like a good hunt. Yeah. They don't pray that God comes down or God sends an intermediary down to do the hunt for them. No. They know very well the rule of cause and effect, but they go and make the tools themselves. They go do the hunt themselves, but they pray that they will have a successful hunt, for example. Or before they go picking the berries or the root vegetables, they pray they have a good harvest, you know. And sometimes they pray for ethical things as well. They pray for forgiveness of sin, and they pray for protection from sinning or harming other members of their tribe. And these prayers are remarkably similar, despite the massive distance between the tribes
Wow. Wow.
geographically. Now, they fell into blasphemy here and there as well, but even their blasphemies are very similar, which is, this is
Wow.
mind-boggling, you know. I think in
Wow. Wow.
future episodes, we'll open up the worship and their ethics, yeah.
Yeah. So are we
Also,
talking about the so are we talking
the
about the
primitive culture. No,
primary one?
primary is the second level.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
primary
we are
is a
talking
bit
about the
younger.
primitive people and their prayers. We're talking about them,
Yeah,
right?
yes, yeah.
So we see a cross cultural consistency in the kind of prayers also they used to make,
Mm.
not just their moral framework,
Yeah,
not just
we
their
see it.
theology, but
Yep. The fact that they
wow.
have prayers to the supreme being stands out from even the other tribal cultures who are ethnically younger. The prayers are similar, the blasphemies are similar, and when we go into this, you'll see it's just mind-boggling. Yeah, uh,
Wow.
their aversion to incest is almost universal amongst the primitive culture, whereas in later cultures, civilizations as well, they delved into this and they even accepted it and even made it part of some religions. They had an absolute aversion to adultery. They had the death penalty for it in some cases. They were staunch upon marriage. Marriage was their way of life. Didn't do adultery, didn't do the group sex, but later cultures did. Yeah. They did have some strange and bizarre habits which would be very distasteful to us, for example. But along with that, so the ethnologists didn't shy away from this. They didn't say they were angels. But along with that, in other areas, they had far higher moral standards than even people in later civilizations. You know, and like I say, they attributed their ethics to the supreme being. A lot of the time, or some of the time, especially in the later cultures or the younger cultures, knowledge of the supreme being was limited to the priests or the shamans or whatever you want to call them. Whereas in the primary cultures, it was more widespread. Sometimes the children didn't learn about the supreme being until initiation, which happened at puberty. But this learning about the supreme being at the initiation happened in South America, happened in Australia, happened in Africa. How was that possible if all of this was not like happening in the unified culture before they broke up? So even the small details are very similar. And as regards the supreme being, like I say, in the primary cultures, the concept was more pure. Some cultures said that trying to understand the supreme being's form was like trying to grasp the wind. The Tierra del Fuegians said this, basically saying he can't be understood. Some say he gives off so much glory and light and splendor that he cannot be looked upon. Yeah. Other cultures did fall into like the anthropomorphic stuff. Not necessarily that they said God was a human being, but they said he incarnated. A lot of even the primary cultures said that God took an incarnation at the beginning of time, just like the Christians say God walked with Adam. For the Christians, this doesn't reduce God's rububiyyah and his attributes of lordship. Neither did it do for them, but it's obviously something we would reject. We don't believe in incarnation. We believe there's nothing whatsoever like Allah. His glory and his majesty is far too great to be compared to anything. But the point is, even though they accepted some level of incarnation, it didn't reduce the supreme being's rububiyyah. You understand? Now, later cultures, when you hit the primary and the secondary levels, they started to say that the supreme being had a wife and children.
Okay.
Well, Allah doesn't shy away from this in the Quran either. In many verses, particularly at the beginning of Surah Jinn, there is a verse that translates where the jinn say, and the foolish one amongst us, meaning Iblis, has been saying that Allah has a wife and child. There are other verses as well related to the same topic, but Schmidt, in his division of the cultures, he showed that this was a later thing. Because the Tierra del Fuegians, they were asked by someone from Schmidt's school, Wilhelm Koppers, because he was trying to investigate, is their belief real monotheism or not? He actually specifically asked them. They have a very hard to pronounce name for God, which I can't remember, but it's a right tongue twister. But he asked them, does God have a wife? And he said, without fail, they just looked at him as if he had said something ludicrous.
Wow.
So even the attribution of a wife and children and familial relations comes in the later tribal cultures. And we saw it in Sumeria as well. And we see this, it's quite known in later civilizations as well,
So
also, just let me hit one more point, please. When it comes to the shirk, these tribes had a lot less shirk, and the beings they petitioned or worshipped were said to be created by wholly dependent and below the supreme being anyway. They were used as an intercession or for a specific need. Okay, and then the anthropomorphism, like I said, it does increase in the primary and secondary cultures, but it decreases drastically in the primitive cultures. We can't say it's not. Like they may anthropomorphize, but they may say God has a form, but it's not. It's something absolutely unique, and it's like something. It's a form, but it's like a bizarre kind of form. It's not a unique and so on, but it is still there. But like even so, like when we take the ethics, the prayers, the creed, and put that under the 4 criteria that Schmidt came up with, especially the first one, the geographic distribution, there's no real explanation for this if monotheism wasn't primal to mankind in the beginning. And we believe that Allah sent prophets over and over anyway. It doesn't mean the message is accepted, but what we're saying is the monotheism was primal, and if you're going to come on any other system, how do you explain these facts?
Yeah, exactly. And so basically we see purity of monotheism the more we go back. And then there was one quote I had heard from scholar Abdullah Andalusi. He mentioned a very interesting point, which was that we as Muslims try to keep the infinite and the finite separate. So like infinite as in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's not like the creation, we try to make this kind of divide as far as possible. And then slowly, maybe maybe with these cultures also, slowly we can see the infinite and the finite mixing when, for example, incarnations are concepts like incarnations are brought into the picture. And then with the primary cultures, we see more and more stuff adding more of anthropomorphism and giving God some kind of a family and giving family members to God.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that even if they believe that God incarnated at a certain point for a certain purpose, which the Christians do, not just with Jesus, but according to the Old Testament as well, it doesn't reduce for them the exalted attributes of lordship that God has, but every single point of Christian theology, or almost every single point of it that we would consider a negation or shirky, is in the shirk of the primary and the secondary cultures as well. Now, how is that possible if Shaitan is not using the same tricks on mankind over and over? And
Exactly.
I would encourage any Christian watching, to ask yourself, like, how come, the idea of incarnation, the idea of God having a son, although you don't believe it's a begotten son, even the idea of Trinity crops up in ancient cultures here and there. Well, it's not the same. Yeah, I know they'll jump on me and say the Christians have a unique Trinity, and you do, I grant it.
Yeah.
But the Trinitarian doctrine is, or the triad doctrine associated with God is there as well. How is it possible that your avenues of shirk are also in these cultures that you would consider to be heathens anyway? Were they on the right track in their paganism or their heathenism when they started to develop shirk? Because it goes in line with Christian shirk.
Exactly.
That's a side point, but again, we can go into that in a future video.
Yeah, I mean, for another discussion for another day. But for example, if we look into the development of Christianity itself, we see that there is something like later on it kind of develops into a complete doctrine. But if you see in the onset of it, maybe there were people who did not believe that
obviously,
Jesus was just a man. There we see historically there were some groups that did not believe that Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, was actually God, but just a man or a prophet or something like that.
Can I jump in?
We have Unitarian Christians that actually believe that there is only one God. So there are some things that are still there. Yeah, I mean, please go ahead.
Can I jump in regarding degeneration of religion? Here, you've reminded me of something. Yeah, obviously for us, Jesus, peace be upon him, was a prophet, and a caller to monotheism. And there were groups of monotheistic Christians in the beginning. There still are Christians who are monotheists who identify as Christian. But the point is, even the Christian shirk was later additions. So that shows us if there's not a prophet or the followers of a prophet there to reinforce the monotheistic message, religion doesn't go that way. It goes that way. And listen, even within Islam, the Prophet ﷺ said in an authentic hadith, the best of generations is my generation, then the one after, and then the one after. Yeah. And in another authentic hadith, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that towards the end of time, my followers will be like the foam of the sea, numerous, but basically about as much use as the foam on top of the sea. Yeah. So even the Prophet ﷺ, he told us that the overall religious condition of the Ummah will slip. It doesn't mean that your individual condition has to slip. No, there have been excellent Muslims in every single generation, no doubt, but nowhere near as good as the first generation or the second or the third. So even within Islam, we have a kind of a concept of degeneration. Alhamdulillah, Allah has protected this Ummah from shirk and from falling into what the Jews and the Christians did. We have evidences for that as well. But the quality of the Ummah as a whole goes down. And this is proven as well over time.
I mean,
I'm not saying there are not most excellent Muslims from every generation. There are, and we should strive to be the best Muslim we possibly can and take this hadith as a warning, in fact. But still, we have an example of degeneration to some extent, not to the shirky level, within Islam as well.
Exactly. So I mean, if we look into the subcontinent,
sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
If you look at the creed of Moses compared to the Old Testament depiction of the other prophets, which we don't agree with, the creed of Moses was far more pure than anything that the Old Testament puts forward regarding the later prophets. The creed of even according to them, Judaism was more pure when Moses was there, who was not the first prophet for Bani Israel, but because you had Yusuf before and stuff like that, but their creed, even according to the Old Testament, is getting worse and worse as time goes on, because the Quran actually agrees with the Bible on this, that they fell into shirk and kufr and basically heinous sins over and over, which is why they ended up being punished here and there. And both the Quran and the Old Testament agree with this. But again, as you go forward chronologically, according to the history of the Jews, things go downhill as well. So if you're an evolutionist or you hold to the animistic theory or whatever, then how do you account for these things? You know,
Exactly.
how do you account for, even within the religions, things are not improving as a whole? But we know Islam will be revived. Yeah, Islam will be revived. Again, that takes a reviver to come.
Right.
No, that takes a reviver to come. You should revive, we should revive ourselves, strive to be the best we can for the sake of Allah, not lose hope. But Islam will be revived. We know this from authentic hadith as well. But when a reviver comes, you see, so the nafs is inclined to different types of sins. Yeah, different nafs will go worse than others, but the point is, you've got to rein it in somehow. You know, you've got to rein it in, or our tendency is to go like this as human beings. If you don't rein yourself in, you know.
Right. And
another. Okay, let's leave it for another video.
Yeah. So the just one point that comes to my mind, as you mentioned about anthropomorphism, also, like, you know, we see anthropomorphism later developing much more and more and more, and you know, the infinite kind of mixing with the finite in some sense. But then, for example, if we look into, for example, some works of psychology, like, you know, works of Olivera Petrovich from Oxford, we find that, you know, there's something fascinating there, that, you know, children normally, when there was some research done on that subject, and when they are born with some kind of non-anthropomorphic ideas about God, even God being a natural tendency in some sense. Children are born with a non-anthropomorphic idea of God. So we get another point here, which kind of is in line with the evidence that humans generally don't have anthropomorphic ideas of the supreme being, but then maybe that is brought into culture, or maybe by other means we have, like, you know, kind of got into it. So if we have the oldest civilization having more close to non-anthropomorphic ideas about God, and then normal children in our times also having this kind of simple idea of having non-anthropomorphic ideas about God, I mean, it kind of syncs together and makes a perfect, like, you know, form of in some sense of a better framework we have, which can explain the data quite well.
Of course. I mean,
this is a problem for the evolutionist in some sense, which because there's a lot for them to explain and, you know, make sense of it, not for us, because it kind of fits well with our narrative.
Yeah, because the innate perception of a creator or a maker is not learned. You know,
yeah, exactly.
It's not learned. So where does it come from? And it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere in children everywhere, you know. So where does that come from? But that's another sidetrack. And actually,
exactly,
within the original monotheism evidences, there is a lot of evidences for fitra as well. But that's another good reminder for a later video.
Another discussion.
Okay. Can we go to some critiques of Wilhelm Schmidt?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I'll do a few general ones before I go to specific ones. A lot of evolutionist scholars label or they threw the accusation of bias at him because he was a Catholic. Now, this shows that they didn't look at his work at all, because Schmidt did not use theology or scripture to support his work. He never hid away from the fact that he was a Catholic theologian, but he was scientific in his methodology, and he invited his opponents into his own monthly publication to challenge him and stuff. You know, so this accusation of bias fails, as he only used data and facts, not scripture. Yeah, and it also exposed their bias, because they don't even hypothetically consider an early revelation to mankind from God. Yeah, but they don't admit it. They won't jump up and say, "Oh yeah, look, I'm a proud evolutionist," or this. But Schmidt did. He said, "Yeah, I'm a Catholic priest. I'm not hiding that from you. But I'm not appealing to my scripture for this. I believe it, but I'm not appealing to my scripture for it." Yeah, so that's a very, very weak accusation thrown at him. Yeah. Another accusation thrown was that the supreme being is not the supreme being of Western Christianity. Well, come on, bro. Come on. You know, I mean, it was never supposed to be in the first place. He's saying that religion degenerates over time. So the concept of the supreme being, will also degenerate over time. Yeah, so that's especially like from the Islamic paradigm, that's just dumb, man. Because if you want to use the Arab mushrikun in the Quran as a model, which you can roughly, Allah never says that they have everything correct about him. You know, there is negation, there is shirk, there is attribution of things that don't suit his majesty, but the rububiyyah is there with them. Yeah, they don't put anything on the same level as Allah, like the Christians do. You know, Christians say Jesus, Holy Spirit are the same as the Father in ability and stuff. But the mushrikun said, if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will say Allah. Who provides for you from the heavens? Who sends down the rain? Allah. Who owns the sovereignty? They will say Allah. So how are you deluded? The Quran says, but like that's another non-argument.
Yeah.
Second or the third general argument, and this is used against original monotheism in general, is they say that this comes from cultural cross-contamination from missionaries. Again, this shows they didn't, because look where the tribes were found, and the earliest reports of original monotheism come from the 1500s. They were much fewer back then, but as time went on, more and more came in. We're talking about people in areas and times that like it simply wasn't possible for them to take anything from Christians. And the how of this is ridiculous as well, because if they took from Christians, what would they be, Khalid? What would they
Christians,
be?
of course. Obviously, they would be Christians, yeah.
Not only are they not Christians, the tribes that believe in a supreme being, they don't even mention the Bible. They don't talk about the Gospels. They don't talk about Jesus. They don't talk about the cross. They don't have the Christian Trinity, so on and so forth. They don't know about the Israelite prophets. But somehow, in the 17, 18, and early 1900s, before modern communication methods were a thing, they managed to take a concept of the supreme being from Christianity, which is totally different anyway, and rewrite their lore, which is centuries, if not thousands of years old, being passed down and protected generation to generation, to just tweak this little thing here from Christianity and then spread that over hundreds of miles within continents, but thousands of miles when you include all of the continents. Before they had phones or any away with this, you have to be a telepath to do this, basically. So
that's quite a radical claim to make.
That's why I said some of the contentions were ridiculous, and this shows these contentions are not just from slackness. They're from pre-assumptions and being stuck in the atheistic circle or hula hoop, if you like.
Wow. So there's one more point, like we can think of, is that, for example, let's for the sake of the argument, imagine that yes, actually these Christian missionaries went and they wanted to talk about Christianity, but by some larger reason, like they did not adopt Christianity, but they all adopted the rububi aspects of God in some sense. And you see that consistency, but you don't see any kind of consistency about having the Christian doctrine embedded within their theology. So how is that possible?
Excellent point. So they acknowledge that Schmidt was right in his discovery of original older monotheism amongst the tribal peoples, but they poo-poo his methodology and come up with an explanation that defies any and all sense. So we can chuck that one as well, I think. Now we come to one which is slightly better, but still not really an acceptable criticism. Remember I said Schmidt was an expert in native languages and polymath and this, and so were the other people in his school. The technicality of his writings was criticized, and the amount of them. So they're saying, firstly, the book is too big. Secondly, it's too technical, even for us as scholars. This is not a criticism in reality. That's a praise.
It's a compliment. It's a compliment.
It's a scholar's job to read big books and to be familiar with technical ideas and terms. So again, it's a compliment. Now, to be fair, some of the people who opposed him did compliment him on his work ethic, his knowledge, and his status as a learned person, even if they disagreed with his conclusion. Okay, now let's go to something a bit different. Raffaele Pettazzoni, an Italian historian, who said that monotheism could not have been primal because, according to him, monotheism is revolutionary or reactionary. According to him, there are four monotheistic religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism. And according to his reading of the scriptures of those, which again was slack, which I'll expose in a moment, a prophet is someone who detests the polytheism around him, rallies and rails against it until he gets followers to come on board with him, that the idea that there is only one true God. Now, that is partially true. It's a prophet's job to rally, rail, and combat the shirk around him. But what Pettazzoni overlooked is in all four of those scriptures, Islam more clearly, the New Testament, the Old Testament, and even in the Zoroastrian scriptures, they all say that the prophet who was sent is not coming with a new message.
Right.
They all say they're following the prophets from before. And even Zoroastrianism has a passage, I forget the reference, I have it somewhere buried. It says that this is not a new message. This is in the scriptures that Ahura Mazda revealed before. Obviously, there is a string of Jewish prophets, going back to the earlier ones, who are all mentioning the previous prophets anyway. Jesus says, according to the New Testament, he said, I came not to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill. Christians have an interpretation of that, but it doesn't matter. Petazoni wasn't a Christian. So Jesus is saying he's not putting in a new message. And Islam is as clear as daylight that it's not.
And even Christians have this idea of progressive revelation that,
exactly. So look, that shows his slackness in reading of scripture. He took what he wanted. And as one modern scholar, Wilfred Cordovan, said, Moses was in Egypt, but he didn't reform the Egyptian religion. No, he didn't. He called Pharaoh to worship one God, he was refused. Then he took the Israelites out. And Petazoni, then, when he was presented with the massive evidence gathered by Wilhelm Schmidt, he basically simply, what did he, just give me 1 sec. He didn't even engage in a refutation. He didn't even engage in an analysis. And there's a direct quote from this Italian historian saying, Wilhelm Schmidt cannot be correct because he was plugged into his definition of monotheism, that he could not go outside. So for him, it doesn't matter how much data Schmidt has gathered, how hard he worked, how good his findings were, etc., etc. Monotheism is a reaction to polytheism. Therefore, polytheism has to be first. Therefore, I don't care what Schmidt said. Again, it's burying your head in the sand. Okay? We have
I mean some as you mentioned, some objections are really amazing,
I know.
We could have expected better.
I know
of course.
Okay, now we come to
so slightly... can it also be one of the reasons can also be because they don't know the actual claim that we make, or for example Wilhelm Schmidt is making, if they seems like they haven't looked into.
These ones knew. The ones I'm mentioning now, they knew exactly what he meant.
And even after that,
some of them who came later probably didn't, and in fact many today maybe don't as well, but the ones I'm mentioning, they knew, because they were responding directly to the evidence that he brought forth. So the next shubahat is Schmidt rejected, like I said, the ascending evolutionary ladder for mankind, but they said him and all of those engaged in the cultural historical school fell into the same trap, which is why I covered that earlier. Schmidt never ever said there was necessary stages. He never said a culture had to pass through animism or totemism or magism or star worship. He's saying our culture historical method shows 1 happened, 2 happened, 3 happened, 4 happened. The direction may be upwards, then backwards, then left, then right, then stagnant, but there is no framework, or there is no ascending ladder or descending ladder of stages that must have happened, as opposed to all the evolutionist schools. So that was put forward by an anthropologist called Paul Radin, who also done more technical refutations, but Wilfred Cordovan, who is a modern proponent of original monotheism, has refuted Radin on everything. Now we come to the last guy, who is E. Evans Pritchard, a British anthropologist. He's considered to be in the top 3 anthropologists of the last century, which makes him one of the best of all time. He fell into the same trap as Radin, but this guy did not agree with any origin theory of religion. He refuted all the evolutionist theories in the minutest of detail. This guy was genius as well, to be fair. Refuted them all, and he refuted all psychological origin theories, all sociological origin theories, and he wrote extensively on their refutations. But when he writes about Wilhelm Schmidt, he writes about him about 2 pages, if I remember correctly. First, he agrees that Schmidt and his school were the only ones that came with a testable methodological framework that was viable for anything, as compared to the evolutionists. He then says he doesn't agree with Schmidt. However, he then says, I know the matter is more complicated than I am permitted to treat here, and I'm dealing with it far too briefly. He didn't say why. He did not say why he opened up the other ones far more than he did with Schmidt, and he acknowledged Schmidt's caliber as well, to be fair. He also even used Schmidt and Andrew Lang in refutation of some of the evolutionists.
Okay.
Then he falls into the same trap as Paul Radin, saying that Schmidt contradicted himself by establishing necessary steps. But it wasn't the case. It wasn't the case. So his refutation of Schmidt was way more brief. He himself admitted that he didn't go into detail. He didn't say why. He got it wrong that him and the Culture Historical School established a necessary ladder of steps. It wasn't like this. They just said happenings happened, and here's how we interpret it. He then says, one paragraph, he references Raphael Pettazzoni and says monotheism may have to be a negation of polytheism for it to exist, according to Pettazzoni. Again, he doesn't say why. He doesn't go into any details in support of it. And then he says something to the effect of, I have to leave the idea of monotheism being original in the same place as I leave animism, sociological theory, political theory, etc. Yeah, but he doesn't say why, and his refutation is far more brief, and he falls into something which was later refuted as well. So I actually emailed a modern day scholar about this, and you know what he told me? Later in life, this guy, E. Evans Pritchard, the top anthropologist, converted to Catholicism. But at the time he wrote against Schmidt, I didn't know this. The guy emailed back to me and said, at the time he was a secular. He was secular, atheistic.
Okay.
So clearly he was biased as well.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
And we'll open him up a little bit more. I think it's well worth opening him up because how he refuted the other theories is amazing as well. Like he took them right down to the minutest details and went in really aggressively on them, you know, as opposed to what he did with Schmidt. But he didn't want to accept what Schmidt brought. And he came to the same conclusion that I mentioned earlier. Origin of religion cannot be known. To be fair to him, he didn't slant towards the animistic, totemistic, demonology side. He didn't. He just left them all and said, we cannot know. But like I say, his refutation of Schmidt is pathetic compared to what he did with the rest. You know?
Yeah. So if we summarize his point of view, it was more like he went on refuting these theories of evolution, like animism being first, demonism being first, etc., etc., etc. But then when it comes to Wilhelm Schmidt, he kind of he got into a straw man of his position and not actually trying to address his position. And then he did not, even though he kind of admitted that, you know, Wilhelm Schmidt provides a method that is very well testable and backed up by evidence in some sense. But then he himself did not provide a solution to the problem which he mentioned as was a problem.
Exactly. And one point I missed, sorry, he also said Wilhelm Schmidt successfully refuted all of his opponents.
Okay, wow.
So what was in the back of his mind then? How did he manage to do this? And why is the refutation of his so short? Why did you use him and Andrew Lang in refuting the others as well? You know, plus he wasn't Catholic at the time, but he became Catholic later in life, which I knew he converted. But when I emailed the scholar, the modern day scholar, I didn't know he was secular at the time of writing, but that kind of puts a little bit of shade over the whole thing, you know?
Okay.
He kind of falls into the bias category as well there.
Yeah, so if we summarize
top marks to him for his other refutations. Top marks.
Wow. So if we summarize all of these refutations against Wilhelm Schmidt, whatever is available at hand, we see that, you know, either they are some straw mans, either they are some arguments that are not plausible at all, and nothing substantial on this side where we can say that, you know, there is something like, you know, really substantial backed up by evidence where we can, you know, refute Wilhelm Schmidt's theory completely. So the best explanation so far, if we see in terms of trying to find the best explanation for the data that we see, it makes much more sense that, you know, original monotheism still stands as the best explanation for all of the data that we spoke about.
Yes, of course, according to the facts, you know. Now I'll go to some positive comments on Wilhelm Schmidt. And actually one total U-turn. There are more U-turns, and this is something I wanted to touch on. There are more U-turns from people in history, psychology, archaeology based on Schmidt's data, where they went from being evolutionist, like Langdon, to original monotheist school. But Langdon wasn't based on Schmidt's, as we already said. But I just want to say that some Christians didn't even accept original monotheism originally. they said that it's impossible that these heathens could know the one true God. They haven't been enlightened by the gospel. How can this be? One of them was a theologian called Raoul Allier. He's a French theologian and lecturer in philosophy. And he says he was against original monotheism despite being a Christian. He says, when we took up our task, the idea of a primitive monotheism appeared to us inspired by a priori dogmatism. So insistence based on belief, basically. The investigations of Wilhelm Schmidt, a Catholic scholar universally known and respected, now appear to us disquieting or upsetting. The notion of a supreme being gives the impression now and again of becoming more clearly defined the farther back through the course of the ages we go. It is recognized that scholars, and not the least of them, including secular, are declaring today that the whole problem must be taken up again, but that was back then, not now. You understand? And they were few, but it did happen. Again, another Christian who basically did a U-turn on the basis of the evidence. We have Dr. K.L. Bellon, who was professor in the University of Nijmegen, I hope I pronounced it right, in Holland. And he published on the science of comparative religion in Dutch. And speaking about Schmidt, he says, as a positive result of the investigation of Wilhelm Schmidt, we must undoubtedly accept that the oldest cultures and the most primitive tribes have knowledge of an almighty and beneficent high God. How this belief originated, we do not know, but we do know with certainty that it did not originate from any of the factors or germs proposed in evolutionary theories, because this belief in a high God is rooted in the noblest faculties of man, namely his mind, his emotions, and his will, and found even among the most primitive tribes. Now, again, I could multiply quotes regarding U-turns, and I do want them in the future, inshallah, but there's no point now to keep multiplying the same quote from a different person, you understand? But
Exactly.
it will be quite powerful, you know.
Wow.
So there were very weak critiques that you and I can refute using simple logic. There were more technical critiques that scholars have gone and refuted. Refutations are still there, and people from various different disciplines, including Christians who disagreed with Schmidt, did U-turns on the back of his evidence, you know.
Okay. So that is another point to note. Now we have this framework of Wilhelm Schmidt's, for example, method. And if we, for example, now if we apply this method to, for example, other cultures, other histories of other nations, histories of other, for example, continents, do we find the same amount of evidence? Like, you know, for example, apply it anywhere, like how we applied it to the Sumerian civilization, we found that, you know, we could clearly see the development of monotheism, like from monotheism to polytheism and to other, for example, isms.
Yeah, it's very interesting to look at all of the civilizations. Like I said, when you take Iran, the Semitic civilizations, Sumeria, which were not Semitic but in the Middle East, China, even Japan, Egypt, and the subcontinent, we get to varying degrees as we travel back in time historically, either lesser polytheism, maybe we don't find a clear monotheism, but polytheism is lesser, a henotheism, or a monotheism, you know. So as we travel back in time, all the types of polytheism are dropping off, and the creed is becoming evidently more pure and more clear. Now, the good thing about the subcontinent is we have a long-standing civilization, but we also have data from indigenous tribes, so to speak.
Wow.
And we can have a look at both, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, that's another interesting topic.
So let me just grab my notes here. If we look at the scripture, obviously the Vedas are the oldest of the Hindu scripture. Rig Veda is primary. There are about 33 gods, depending on who counts and what's considered a separate god or not. So the polytheism is there. However, there are some passages that have a monotheistic hint or flavor, if you like. I wouldn't be so triumphant to say that there's a passage that says there is only one God, because when you take them in context, they look a bit different to when you take them alone out, you know, take them out and analyze them alone. But like some quotes from scholars who are specialists in India talking about the monotheistic trail or tracks left in the Vedas. Here we go to Max Muller, who was a German-born philologist. He wrote many scholarly and popular works on the subjects of India, and he was a specialist in Sanskrit as well. He says there is a monotheism that precedes the polytheism of the Veda, and even in the invocations of innumerable gods, the remembrance of a God one and infinite breaks through the mist of idolatrous phraseology like the blue sky that is hidden by passing clouds. So a very beautiful quote there. But he's basically saying that the human heart protests every now and then at this polytheism, and it starts to go back towards giving supremacy. But the point is the supremacy is given to different gods in different passages. So again, we have a muddled theology as civilization grows on, which supports us as well. And then we have a quote from Sir Monier Williams, who was professor of Sanskrit at Oxford, and I think his is more accurate than Muller's. He says, in the Vedas, unity in the conception of deity soon diverged into various ramifications, meaning it went different ways. Only a few of the hymns appear to contain the conception of one divine, self-existent, omnipresent being, and even in these, the idea of one God present in all nature is somewhat unclear and undefined. And I would say his quote is more accurate, but there's another very beautiful quote from a German scholar, I believe. Yeah. This guy is called Pater Hausler, who wrote in the Anthropos magazine, our journal founded by Wilhelm Schmidt, and he calls the Vedic theology the twilight of the day, meaning that it's getting more dark instead of getting brighter, and it's approaching polytheism. And he gives another very beautiful, picturesque quote. He says, the hymns of the Veda echo a curfew that tolls the knell of the parting day, tolls the end of the parting day. They come to us like a lament, means expression of sadness for non-English speakers, non-native speakers. They come to us like a lament for the rights of a purer time that has vanished. This assertion may appear incredible since it contradicts all evolutionary theories, yet its truth will surely be more and more confirmed as we progress in accurate knowledge of the origins and development of Indian religion. Now, obviously, as we know, Khalid, you will certainly know, being Indian yourself, the most elaborate and the most vast system of pantheism, stroke polytheism, or pantheism and polytheism ever developed, we still have available to us is from the subcontinent, okay? No one disputes this. No one disputes this at all. So we've gone from 33 gods and a very simple polytheism with hints of monotheism in the Vedas to a point where, depending on what school of Hinduism you follow, anything and everything can be deified and has been deified. Yeah, whether you want to say these things are avatars of the one God or the necessary existence who is not really God in the Upanishads, or their emanations or this, that, or the other thing. The point is the objects of worship under these systems have gone through the roof. Like I said before, they're now gone beyond all classification, even if you want to call them avatars or emanations. Yeah.
So there is one thing interesting, which is that, if you see scholars or those who study the Vedas, they have come to a conclusion, even though they are they kind of not unrelated to each other, they come to the same conclusion, because that is something.
They're from different countries and they're not referencing each other at all. And Max Muller was way earlier than the other ones I quoted from,
Wow. So this is another point to note, that scholars from different parts of the world, different time zone, they kind of come to the conclusion that there is some kind of development within the Vedic scripture. If we see that it is kind of more closer to monotheism and then moves away from monotheism.
And there are some modern scholars who don't need to keep multiplying examples as well, who said exactly the same thing about that there are hints of monotheism in the earlier scripture, and there is less polytheism. Yeah. Now, just like Sumeria, the creed becomes purer as you go back. We also have muddled supremacy. The term henotheism originated with Max Muller, and he used it to describe the situation in the Vedas where one God was being addressed by the author as if he was supreme. Okay. In other passages, the author of the other passage addresses another God if he was supreme. And we can briefly have a look. Like, you have the God Dios Pitar, or however you want to pronounce it, or depending on who reads it. He is mentioned as supreme in Mandala 1, hymn 164. He's addressed as father and begetter by the author. However, he's already Deus Atheosis, very remote God, not with an active cultus, not as active as the other gods. In another verse, Dios is mentioned with Indra, Both of them are said to have supreme dominion in the same verse. How does that work? Both be having supreme dominion. It doesn't work. In another verse, Agni and Surya are said to be the sons of Dyaus, and Agni even approaches supreme later on. And in the hymn where the author mentions Dyaus as father and begetter, the scholars have said this hymn is also tinged with a sadness at a monotheism that author knows has been lost. Now, Dyaus vanishes. He vanishes even in the Vedas, he disappears, and supremacy is given to Varuna. Not just Rububiyya attributes, but also justice, wisdom, mercy, forgiveness, etc. As time goes on, he goes more and more into the background. Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, which are the later scriptures, he's dust, he's gone, he's nowhere to be seen. Although he's given great importance and in the Rig Veda, he gives way to Indra, who has no ethical qualities whatsoever. He's described as being a warrior, thunder god who likes to drink alcoholic soma juice and such and such. But he is even called king of the gods. So he's king of the gods. This one is king of the gods, and he's king of the gods. Indra, in later scriptures, this so-called king of the gods even disappears. Okay. I won't stay too much on their scripture, but with the Upanishads, then the concept of the necessary, impersonal, pure existence, who's not really interested in anything, nor can be, is introduced as the Brahman, but a very distant kind of necessary, cold existence. The concept of the soul is brought in, the concepts of karma and transmigration, which are not in the Vedas. The afterlife is barely even mentioned in the Vedas. And then the next iteration of Hinduism contains the Bhagavad Gita. And this seems to rally against the whole cold, necessary existence, unpersonal originator, because now you have the Trimurti, the Hindu Trinity. And Brahma, who is different from Brahman, is sometimes supreme, sometimes creator of the gods. And he's seen to be the greatest of the Trinity. But apart from his role as creator, he then fades into the background. You have Vishnu, who is the world protector, maintainer, ruler of all. He has 10 avatars, including Krishna. Some people say Krishna is the supreme being. Some say no, he's under the Vishnu. You have Shiva, who is the destroyer and governs the end of all things. In the Vedas, you had the god Rudra, who was actually Shiva. In the Upanishads, they're merged into two. They are called Rudra Shiva. And they're given a kind of another non-ethical role for a god, just like the Indra was. Then he comes back to being Shiva in the Bhagavad Gita, and Rudra is demoted to one of his avatars. So also, like, I've only spoke about it for a few minutes, but the scholars who wrote on the Vedas, they said that theological contradictions, they just abound. Supremacy goes from here to here to here to here to here. Gods get added, gods disappear, gods get changed. This is not a coherent theology at all. So just like Egypt and Sumeria and the Semitic civilizations, in their later stages, theology gets muddled as well as polytheism increasing.
So do we have any kind of, for example, time frame to see that in this time frame this was a prevalent belief, and in that time frame the belief kind of shifted to
basically the Western date of the Vedas is about, they give it roughly 1500 BC. Indian scholars, they put it much earlier, but that doesn't seem to be very accurate. Then you have centuries in between the Upanishads and the massive change in creed. You have centuries in between the Bhagavad Gita, another massive change in creed. And obviously, as we know, contradiction is a benchmark for falsehood. Because you don't have just changes in creeds. You have changes in the status and roles of the so-called gods as well. But let me ask you, Khalid, Sanskrit is the language of the Vedas, yeah?
Yeah.
Can Sanskrit be considered to be indigenous to the subcontinent as a language?
I wouldn't be sure about that.
They can't, because it's it's Indo-Aryan. Yeah. Now, there's dispute on how the Aryans arrived in India, but there's no dispute they're latecomers. There's no dispute they arrived in India from elsewhere. There's dispute on how and why they arrived, but there's no dispute they arrived in India as latecomers. Therefore, if the Vedas is in their language, it cannot be an indigenous religion. It may partly be, but the most logical conclusion is that, at least in large part, it cannot be. Because why would they bring a theology in their own language, i.e. Sanskrit, and then adopt a, completely foreign creed? It doesn't make sense. So, like I said, if we go to the tribes who managed to hold on to some of their indigenous culture after looking at the scriptures, although we do still have clearly decreasing polytheism as we go back and increasing as we go forward with the Indian scriptures, we can get a flavor, we can strengthen the notion that the religion of the Vedas is not indigenous. As I said, with all the other civilizations, the method of going backwards chronologically and historically can be applied to Sumeria, Egypt, India, China, so on and so forth. And clearly, if there's 33 gods roughly in the Vedas, then you end up with some very elaborate, murky, pantheistic, polytheistic, self-worshipping system in the latest incarnation of the subcontinental religion, Hinduism. The number of objects worshipped clearly is now multiplied beyond all classification, because the Atman, or the soul, was said to be an aspect of Brahman. Therefore, you can even consider yourself divine under some schools of Hinduism. Some schools of Hinduism openly say, some schools of Hinduism, as you know, openly say there are millions of gods. Some say there are unlimited, but they are avatars of the Brahman, or even avatars of his avatar. But their attributes, the supremacy again shifts, things get murky and so on. God's added, God's taken away, which shows that the creed of the civilization is not pure anymore. I'm not narrowing in on the subcontinent here. We say the same for Sumeria, in particular Egypt, later instances in Iran, in China, in Japan, in Babylon, all Semitic nations. It went the same way. The tendency for mankind is to go towards polytheism. The reasons why we'll do in another video, I think, but the clear tendency is for it to increase. Along with civilization, it increases to a level that just boggles the mind,
So we have covered the Sumerian religions, we have covered Wilhelm Schmidt's methods, and now we move on to, for example, the subcontinent, and we see that there is some kind of development which we see in the religions of the subcontinent, or the prominent religions of the subcontinent, which kind of moves towards polytheism, and the increase of polytheism is quite evident. So what is the case with, for example, the tribal societies that are more primitive in some sense, using the primitive in the right sense? What do we see when it comes to, for example, moving towards those tribes in the subcontinent?
Okay, so what I'm going to do, Khalid, is now that we've looked at Indian civilization briefly, I will go to a couple of indigenous tribes, open up some details about their beliefs when it comes to God and lesser deities. After I do the two, I'll give a list of other tribes that this can be applied to as well, but obviously for time's sake, we can't just go and do every tribe, it's simply not realistic. But I just want to restate that the 3 points I made at the beginning, if you've forgotten them, for the viewers, go back, watch them again. And remember, as we said, that if the evolutionist theories or any of the theories are correct, then tribal cultures should have far more polytheism than the civilizational cultures. We've already opened up Sumeria and opened up the subcontinent, and we've seen a massive rise in polytheism as time goes on. And now we'll see that tribal cultures actually have far less, and their monotheism is more clear, more refined, so to speak. And this is totally upside down if you take any of the evolutionary paradigms as correct. So we begin with the Santal tribe. They're a tribe from the northeast of India, stretching all the way over to Bangladesh. Now, these days, a lot of these Santali tribe members are Christian. We'll find out why. And my reference here is a book called Traditions and Institutions of the Santal. And most of this is from Lars Skrefsrud, a Norwegian missionary who began his mission there in 1863. Like I said, this guy was a guy who spent a long time with the tribe, not just a fleeting visit. He learned their language deeply, so much so that the Santalis, the natives, would come to hear him speak their language, because they love to hear a foreigner speak their language to such a great extent. And he wrote a book on Santali grammar as well. And he didn't just write about their religion, he wrote about their culture in every aspect, but it's their creed we're interested in ourselves, so to speak. Anyway, he began his mission to the Santal tribe. And after many years spent among them, I want to state that again, this is key, he found an elder who had enough knowledge to relate their creation story and their migration story. Now, as I've said before, if you go on Wiki and Google the religion of any particular tribe, you won't get any of this. You know, you'll get a few paragraphs here and there, and that's based on extremely limited data, most likely biased and at least Slack, or possibly both, okay? And I just want to, before I start the story as well, Winfried Corderan, who is a modern scholar who has written about original monotheism, and others have said that when it comes to tribal stories, some elements of them are very fantastical and very bizarre but simple at the same time. But we have to separate the fact that the fantastical elements were not necessarily believed by the tribe. I can't speak for this tribe in particular, but other people after initiation into tribes realized, okay, so they don't necessarily believe all the fantastical and simple elements of their creed, of their stories, and some parts of their stories are creedal. So there is a difference between what they actually held as a creed and some parts of the stories are stories which were told for entertainment. So anyway, after many years, Mr. Skrefsrud managed to get hold of an elder, and he asked him about Thakurju, which means genuine God in their language, because he started here mention of Thakurju, and he knew that meant genuine God, and he had spent many years among them, saw them invested in demonology, witchcraft, worship of the sun, and various nature spirits. Then he got shocked, okay? So he managed to locate someone after a bit of time who had knowledge of their creation story and so on and so forth. So it begins with Thakurju, genuine God, making a primal pair, first man and first woman. Now, you have to present the story honestly. In between the beginning of the story and the primal pair, there is a lot of simplistic, bizarre elements, like different animals are asked to perform jobs in the creation. Sometimes they cannot do it, sometimes they can. And this strange run culminates in the first pair of humans, i.e. one man, one woman, being born from a pair of bird eggs. Like I say, some of the details in the tribal stories become wild, but the base is the same. The Supreme God has created the first two humans via a method we totally reject, but still.
Yeah, any kind of kafia is still, I mean... not relevant here.
They were placed in a region to the west of India, which they call Hiri Hiri Pipiri. It doesn't say where it is, but it's from the west of India, which we would generally agree with anyway. The civilization started from the Middle East, and we don't have a problem saying that the first humans were placed there. We don't know for sure. They were naked, and they lived in peace. However, they were unaware of their nakedness. So that matches as well. There, a demonic being named Lita tempted them to make rice beer. Again, there's fantastical, strange elements, but this results in them pouring part of the beer on the ground, which seems to be some sort of ritual or offering. Then both Haram and Ayo, which are the primal pair, became drunk on the rest of the beer and slept. When they awoke, they knew they were naked and felt ashamed. There's more fantastical elements again. Now the story becomes slightly more genealogical, and later on it becomes a lot more genealogical, and we'll open that up in a bit. But the primal pair, Ao and Haram, bore 7 sons and 7 daughters, who married and founded clans. They all had grandchildren. The grandchildren were not allowed to marry. They could marry cousins, but not brothers and sisters. The clans then migrated to a region called Kroj Kaman, where they stayed for a long, long time, not mentioned, but until their behavior became utterly corrupted. And the story says they behaved like buffaloes, which is their way of saying they became evil, animalistic, you know. So Thakurju called mankind to return to him. It doesn't say how, it doesn't mention sending a prophet, but it says that man refused. He then took a pair, a holy pair, they say, from the descendants of the primal pair, and hid them in a cave on Mount Harata. Now that sounds very much like Mount Ararat, but that's what they call it, Mount Harata. Then Thakur-Ju destroyed the rest of mankind, in some reports with a rain of fire, or sometimes with regular rain. So that matches with our story as well.
Wow.
Later on, descendants of the holy player multiplied again, and they migrated to a plain called Sasanbela, which is still west of India. It means mustard field. And there, Thakur-Ju divided them into many different clans. From here on, it becomes a lot more genealogical. I've left out the names of the places, the kings, the rulers, and the characteristics of the people. But a lot of times throughout history, when you find something genealogical that has been genealogical when it's been passed down orally, it does get confirmed somehow. I'm not saying this has been confirmed, but it becomes a lot more solid from here on in. After the division of mankind, one branch of mankind, their ancient ancestors, migrated first to Jarpi land, then continued eastward from forest to forest until high mountains blocked their way. They desperately sought a way around the mountains, but every route proved impassable. Exhausted, they made a deal with the Maran Buru, which means mountain spirit. Now, this parallels another verse in Surah Jinn, where Allah says that there were rijal among mankind, men among mankind, who sought refuge with men among jinn kind. But the men amongst jinn kind increased them in nothing but rahaqa, which means strife and burden. So here they explain that they know their ancestors were upon Tawheed and how they lost it. They lost it by making a deal with the Maran Buru, which means mountain spirit, to get around the mountain. The deal was, if they let them pass the mountain, when they settled in a country, they would start to worship the Maran Buru, i.e. the shaitan. Okay?
Wow.
They get around the mountain. Yeah. And the wanderer, the relator of the story says, we still acknowledge Thakur-Ju as the genuine God. In the primeval age, we had no bongas, which means spirit, evil spirit. During our wanderings, we got them. And this is how, Maran Buru. Because when Skrefstrod was there, he felt it very strange that the word for evil spirit was Maran Buru, which means mountain spirit, yet they live on flatlands. So he couldn't understand it until he heard this story, you know. He then, the narrator says, after they got the worship of they dipped into the worship of the jinn, the Sin Bonga, which is sun spirit, we also picked up in our way in Sindur. The primeval ancestors were worshipping only Thakur. Having gotten the Bongas, we have gradually forgotten Thakur. Only his name is left. Now the people of the present age have even forgotten mostly his name. Only we who have learnt the story of the ancestors, that's what I'm saying, part of the key, you know, and a few old men remember his name. In the present age, some Santals say that the sun spirit is presumably Thakur. Therefore, when worshipping, they look towards the sun and call this their Thakur. But our ancestors of old have handed over to us via the gurus that Thakur is different. He is not seen by human eyes, but he himself sees all. He has created earth and heaven, the human beings, the animals, the birds, the winged beings, the insects, the snakes, the reptiles, the fish, the crabs, the trees, the plants, the paddy, the rice, the bajra, the corn, all and everything, and he supports all, small and big. He feeds us all. He is the one who brings us here. He is the one who takes us away, meaning life and death. Yeah? By the word of the Bongas and the mountain spirits, or of a human being, we are not born, nor do we go away. Thakur has measured out to us our years, and until this is finished, nobody can take us away. As we are living here, in the same way we shall, when we have gone to the other world, get good or bad by his order. Now the story becomes, like I said, it reads more like a genealogy now. They actually say, we went to this place, it was ruled by this king and this tribe, their main occupation was this, some of us settled here, we tried to settle here, we battled with this tribe, then we battled with another tribe, and on until they landed more or less where they are now in the northeast of India, stroke Bangladesh, or where they are when Mr. Skrefstrod dealt with them. So it thought, like what Cordovan said about the difference between the fantasy and the reality in their stories is very stark here, because the story totally changes when they begin to migrate, you know.
Yeah.
And, yeah, that's about it for the Santalis. So
but you know that the last part was like really interesting when they were kind of admitting that they have forgotten their supreme god, and they've kind of made a deal with the mountain
shaitan.
spirit, the shaitan in some sense. Yeah. And then it is quite similar, although of course we cannot expect everything would be exactly analogous to us, but but it makes a lot of sense. Like it sometimes gives you goosebumps. Like the other parts of the world confirming the same story, like human beings starting from two like a pair of humans, and then
Yeah, it gives you those subhanallah moments,
yeah, the subhanallah moment. Wow, I mean, I'm
And
amazed.
basically, so to recap, we have fantastical elements in the story which we obviously reject, but we're not claiming that the belief is absolutely pure. Yeah.
Yeah,
And this missionary from Norway, Lars Skrefsrud, his mission was the first major mission, at least to the Santal. So this was before they adopted Christianity en masse. They also clearly said in one part of the book that they were not Muslim, and they
yeah,
separated themselves from Islam as well, because there was Muslims there at the time as well in the same area. We have a bizarre creation story, but the foundation is the same. One supreme God creates the primal pair. Okay, the primal pair get tempted by a jinn or shaitan-like figure into doing something that makes them realize their nakedness. Again, the base is the same, the details are different.
yeah,
Then the primal pair begin to have children, and so on and so forth, until mankind becomes wicked, and mankind is destroyed by fire, water, or rainwater, which is very similar to the flood story. A small amount of mankind are saved by Thakor in a cave. Obviously, for us, it's on the Ark, the boat. But the base is the same. Then the human race gets divided into clans and tribes and migrates everywhere, which pretty much don't have a problem with that one either.
yeah.
But
And then
surprisingly, the elder knew his people were upon Tawheed, which is exactly what the Quran says about the people of old. And he knows how they lost it as well. And this matches exactly with the verse in Surah Jinn, where Allah says that the men sought refuge with men from the jinn. The jinn increased them only in rahaqa, which means strife, burden, hassle, trouble, things like this.
yeah. And I was just thinking that for example, even for the sake of doubt, like just if we imagine like the evolutionary story to be true, so are we gonna say that all of these are just coincidences, like all these stories from this part of the world and that part of the world, they all came up with the same story in their head, even though there are some differences there, but it's kind of the foundation is the same, and everyone thinking about the same thing. I mean, it doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, of the criticisms we brought against Wilhelm Schmidt, suppose the only one we could level at them is that they say they were influenced by the Christians. But yet again, I mean, their religion was nothing akin to Christianity. Their creation story is okay. The base of it is the same, but the details are far too different. Plus, if you ask yourself why would the Christians do this and then lie, it doesn't make sense, because it's a greater scalp. It's a greater achievement for a Christian to convert a total heathen who doesn't know a single thing about the one true God. Then it is to say, oh, I came to them and some of their elders had a base knowledge of God. Okay, they fell into deviation here and there, but they actually have a lot in common with the foundations of our story. That lessens his. If he's going to lie, he's going to big himself up.
Yeah, and then if we, for example, see the foundations of Christianity, then we need to have, we see concepts like Trinity and stuff, which is kind of the foundation. So if they are lying about it in some sense, then they would have added their own foundation to it. But
yes, of course.
The foundation that we see is more in line with Islam, is a more Tawhidic foundation that we see.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why would they do that if that is their motive? So
again, these people at the time, they were close to being what I would say indigenous, for want of a better word, and they hadn't had much diffusion from other cultures. They did have some diffusion, without a doubt, but they still retained a lot of their the ancient aspects of their culture, at least religiously, as we can see, and it even backs us up as well that like only the elders knew the true creation story, because this is also, while it did not happen in all the tribes, it happens all around the world. Like the missionary or the anthropologist who is secular or something, he doesn't get to the bottom of things, and he doesn't uncover the traces of monotheism until he gets to speak to one of the learned peoples.
Yeah.
So some of them were quite secretive about what they believed, and this happens over and over again. The reports from the missionaries, the anthropologists, etc., they highlight this over and over again. It wasn't until we got to a learned person, after having learned their language and stuff themselves and gained their trust, that we got this. So again, a surface level scratch is not going to get you anywhere, like in terms of finding the original monotheism, you know.
So maybe we are like short for time. So can we have one more tribe, and then we maybe summarize it? Like,
No,
of course we cannot cover all the tribes out there, but
definitely
I'm
not.
sure there'll be interesting stories out there.
Definitely not. There's no need to anyway, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. The next tribe is the Bil tribe, Bhil in English. Now, as we spoke about the Aryans bringing Sanskrit into India, this tribe are not Aryan. They are pre-Aryan, and they are possibly Vedite, although that is disputed, but they are definitely not Aryan, okay? The reference is from Wilhelm Schmidt, who was professor of ethnology in University of Vienna, and he was directly tied into the school of Wilhelm Schmidt. And the reason he went here, he actually went to the tribe himself, and he went to the Fuegians in the south of America as well, and got initiated into the Fuegians. Exactly, only 2 white men have ever been, as far as I know, but at his time anyway, he was one of them. The reason he did was to test the results of Wilhelm Schmidt's work on monotheism, and he did actually put them to quite a stringent test. We'll see that maybe in a future video, especially on the Fuegians, but for now I'll stick with the Bils because we're in the subcontinent.
So which region do these tribes belong to?
Okay, today the Bils are mixed religion. Some are Muslim, some are Hindu, some are Christian, and some, although I'm not sure how many, I think it's a minority, have held on to the folk religion. Again, if you go to any basic website about the Bils, you won't get much more than that. And you won't find the original monotheism because it's surface scratching. But this guy was actually on the ground with them. You know, he lived with them, learned their language, you know, became trusted by them and became friendly with them, and then went on. So they're from the northwest of India, from the western spurs of the Vindhya and Satpura mountains. They are pre-Aryan, as we said. They do shirk. And like I say, I'm not trying to say they were Muslim by the time Coppers got there. However, they have a distinct supreme creator called Bhagwan. Now, that is a standard word for God, or a God.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is an Aryan word. Like I said, some aspects of Aryan culture have diffused into them. But when you see their beliefs, you see their beliefs are not standard Vedic beliefs or Upanishad beliefs at all. So Bhagwan is absolutely supreme. Yeah. When they do shirk, they offer the excuse, which the Quran highlights are one of the excuses. They say these are simply our intercessors with the Bhagwan. Yeah. They insist all objects of shirk, whether it's the sun, the moon, or the earth, or some adopted deities, are all made by Bhagwan, lesser and below him, totally dependent on him. For example, they say the sun is not God, it's God's lamp. And when they pray to the sun, it's never for anything serious, and it's never in a state of desperation. Coppers himself mentioned that when they are really desperate and real trouble, all the jinn, the sun worship, and whatever goes out the window, and prayers are addressed to Bhagwan alone. Bhagwan is addressed in singular, all the other gods plural. He alone is considered creator. Now that is key because, as we've seen, there is no absolute clear creator in any stage of the Hindu religion. None. Yeah, and a personal God creating from nothing runs counter to almost every system evolved in subcontinental civilization, i.e. the pantheism, the polytheism, the necessity of being, the Brahman, whatever you want to call it. We have a creation ex nihilo here. Bhagwan was alone. He created the lesser deities and made them his servants as bearers of light. Now that's obviously the angels. We don't take them as lesser deities, but we believe that Allah created them and are made from light. So again, the foundational similarity, but shirky detail is different. Some of these were cast down to the earth. Here in their theology, an evil spirit is introduced, and later on, man is created and told about Bhagwan's sole lordship. Now, for us, the jinn were created before mankind as well. So there is another parallel there, and depending on which clan of the Bil you take from, they have different flood stories. Again, the main points are quite similar. Details are different to ours, and even the details are different from clan to clan of the Bils. Yeah. Some of their sayings are that Bhagwan's power is infinite, meaning it's unlimited, obviously. They say the sun gives us light, the earth gives us its fruits, but in reality, it is Bhagwan that gives all of these and everything else, including moral
Wow.
duty. When need is greater, the bill abandons all the objects of false worship. He prays to Bhagwan alone. Bhagwan alone judges souls after death. They say, directed to Bhagwan, it is you who strike and you who save. So it's you who benefit and you who harm. Again, this is total agreement with Islamic theology. Generosity is attributed to Bhagwan. They say Bhagwan will give even if he is not asked. Of course, it is like this as he has created us. So the theology is very simple, but fitri, it's very fitri as well.
Yeah.
One of their prayers is, O giver of corn, please be good to me today. Do not permit harm to come to me. Do not permit me to harm my neighbor. And do not keep us away from corn and clothing. So they are praying for sustenance in the form of food and clothes. They're praying for protection, and they're praying to be good themselves as well. So they clearly do have a kind of an ethical standard. And they ask Bhagwan for help with their ethics and morals. So again, simple stuff, but very fitri as well. When Coppers asked him a lot of questions because he wanted the truth from them, not to confirm Wilhelm Schmidt's findings. He wanted the truth. We can go into that in another video, perhaps with the other tribe, I think is better. But when he asked them about the modality of creation, about the howness of it, and from what did Bhagwan make the world, the response was, I cannot know how Bhagwan made the world. I only know it was formed out of his will and pleasure.
Wow.
They repeatedly stress that all the lesser deities are servants of Bhagwan, and they call everything else, including the sun and the moon, Melela, which translates as employees. So even though they had some shirk, they have far less than subcontinental civilization in its more advanced cultural stages, so to say. And everything whatsoever is called a Malila and an employee and is never put on the same level as their Bhagwan. Also, Coppers mentions something very interesting. I haven't taken the name of the researcher, but he mentions an earlier researcher who had also encountered the same tribe, the Bill, and the indigenous ones as well. This researcher also referenced their monotheism. But Copper said that this man, I'll get the reference maybe for the next video just to be more solid about it. Copper said that this man and his ideas were glossed over and ignored by people simply because of the prevailing evolutionary outlook on the religions of mankind.
Wow.
So now, what he did with the Tierra del Fuegians gave almost the exact same result. Like this Bill tribe, as we said, they're in the northwest of India, okay? The Tierra del Fuegians are literally on the most southern tip of South America. Picture South America, it's like an ice cream cone, it's thick at the top and at the bottom. They're literally right smack down the bottom, like in a totally isolated location. And what came, the data that was gathered regarding them is almost the same as the Bills. I mean, it's shockingly similar,
Wow.
But also Coppers, he's taken from other ethnologists and explorers. Like I said, that's the last tribe I'm going to mention, but I'm going to give you a list of indigenous tribes to the subcontinent who are all either pre-Aryan or non-Aryan, okay? So they did not have the Vedic theology that we spoke about earlier. Yeah, their theology is something different by virtue of their culture. Now, the results with these tribes are they run to different extents. Like sometimes it's not as clear as the Bills, sometimes it is, sometimes they have more shirk, sometimes even less, but they don't all run to the same extent. But I'm just going to name them out now. He expands and says that the Chenchu, the Toda, the Dravida, the Parayans, the Muria, the Koli, Malayali, and the Munda all gave similar results.
Wow. So these are all different tribes in the Indian subcontinent.
Yes, they're all pre-Aryan or non-Aryan. So they did not have the Vedic theology. Yeah, they're pre-Aryan or non-Aryan. So again, when we bounce from this civilizational level of culture to the ethnologically older cultures, i.e. meaning the indigenous, we see far less polytheism, much more clear and lucid monotheism. Even ethics and morality attributed to the supreme being, and so on and so forth. Perhaps I'll go into some details on some of them because some of it is quite useful for fitra evidences as well.
Wow.
And some of it does expose in detail how the evolutionists kind of they ignored some evidences due
Or
to
miss the point entirely, I believe.
maybe on purpose,
Yeah. So like, if we try to pull back, let's keep the Indian subcontinent, and
Okay.
we saw that, for example, when we see the Vedas, we see that there is some aspect of monotheism there,
Oh
and
yeah.
then in the Upanishads also, like, we can see some traces of, like, concepts of what the Veda was indicating towards. That is what we can see.
But
Correct me if I'm.
it's unclear, and it's
Yeah.
already starting to fade out.
Yeah, so it's starting to fade out with the Upanishads, and Upanishads, of course, are a later, like, they came in later.
Yes,
The Vedas are more, like, much more before the Upanishads.
Yeah.
So
Plus
this is.
the main creed is different from Vedas to Upanishads to Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, so the creed changes from the Vedas to the Upanishads, like, to the
Which
Upanishads to the
shows
Bhagavad
that
Gita.
civilizational creeds, they don't remain true to whatever their earliest ancestors were upon. They chop, they
Exactly.
change, they become
So
muddy.
that there is possibility of change in theology.
Hmm.
And then, for example, when we move towards, for example, other tribes, which are, for example, non-Aryan tribes or pre-Aryan tribes also.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
example, we looked at the Santal tribe, and we
Yeah.
saw fascinating similarity, and points that move towards monotheism, or somewhat monotheistic. And then we move, for example, to the other tribe, as you mentioned, BHILL, Bill tribe,
Yeah.
which gave us fascinating results when it comes to similarity with our creed. And then you also mentioned, like, I guess 6-7 tribes, six 7 other tribes, which
Yeah.
all also kind of give us similar results as claimed by that author, which is kind of very fascinating. We see just in the Indian subcontinent that we have, like, aspects of monotheism, and then it degenerates to polytheism. So this is just the same methodology applied to the Indian subcontinent, and you are claiming, and others would claim that, we can apply the same methodology in China, in Japan,
Yes.
in
Yes.
Africa,
Absolutely.
in South America, and all of maybe, and natives of red Indians, maybe North America also. I think you've done a video on that, on some
Yes, I
other
have.
channel.
Yeah.
So looking at this kind of fascinating results, like, of course we don't have time to go deep into all of that, but this is something like really fascinating, and not many people know about it. I'm
True.
just too excited about it, but, like,
I just want to add something.
yeah.
As I said, Wilhelm Koppers, he was from the University of Vienna, and he went out and stayed with the tribes and basically delved into their culture with the intention of looking for the truth regarding to the claims of Wilhelm Schmidt. I believe, this is speculation, but I honestly believe that if others had done what he did, specifically looking for what he was looking for, more
Yeah.
evidences for original monotheism would come to light, because he was able to do it in two parts of the globe which are totally separate, get pretty
Yeah.
much the same results, which is exactly what Schmidt said for here, there, X, Y, and Z. And if we look at the bills are obviously culturally older than the Santalis. They had a more clear monotheism than them, more widespread amongst the people. They had open worship of Bhagwan, but the Santalis didn't. It was restricted to their elder, but their elders still knew that his ancestors were upon the Tawheed, the monotheism. And he knew how he lost it as well, according to their own creation and migration story, When you tie all of these things in together, the case becomes quite solid. Like I say, I could have multiplied examples for pretty much everything, but there's no point. There's no point. The sincere, a person is sincere, they will see the truth when it shows up, and if they're not sincere, then vice versa, But definitely, Khalid, I think we should open up some more avenues of this topic and have a walk down them at some stage, inshallah.
Yeah, I would love to, in fact, and we would love to know from our audiences also, like, if they would love to have us discuss more on these topics. And we have different avenues for example, like, we have a whole subject of, for example, seeing how shirk starts, and it moves towards, more and more in terms of civilizations, and polytheism increases with the whole set of civilization increasing, and humans advancing, and polytheism also increasing along with that. So we can talk about that topic. We can also talk about, for example, as you mentioned,
people have similar prayers, even though they have different languages, different cultures, no contact with each other. They cannot communicate with each other, but they all coming up with the same kind of prayer or similarities between their prayers, and how to worship. Just like we looked at, for example, similar theology, similar prayers, similar moral codes, similar moral codes, and I mean that is quite fascinating. And we can open up any avenues, and if our viewers comment, and we get consistent comment on a particular subject, we would surely have our next discussion on that topic. I would love to.
Inshallah. Yeah.
So I think before, ending the discussion, I think the last thing I would like to mention is that whatever we spoke about has a lot of implications. And if someone is going through all of this with true sincerity, he would see right through it. And it's almost like undeniable, the evidence that we've put forth, even though we can put more. And as you mentioned,
we've only touched on it. We've only barely
so we've just barely touched the surface, and we can see how monotheism is the first religion of mankind. In some sense, it alludes towards that, and it has implications, a lot of implications. So I think those who are sincere viewers, I think they should not deny this fact, and look more into it. So I think another thing that comes to my mind is also we can talk about those who claim to talk about naturalism, and this is what they advocate. I mean, another interesting thing is that when we look at, for example, not just belief in God, but belief in supernatural entities, for example, that is also quite cross-culturally spread out. Like, for example, belief in jinns or some spirits and entities like that, and for example, belief in angels and stuff like that. That is something that we see cross-culturally. So not just but the belief in God, but why would people have all of cross-culturally have same kind of aspects of other spiritual entities also, and come up with the same concepts or similar concepts? That is another thing that which there's a burden or explanation on them to actually explain all of these things.
Of course, like what you say is absolutely correct. Every culture in every time period, no matter the location, believed in unseen spirits or beings, both good and evil, that can interact with us, and that at least some of us can interact with them. How can something which is just a fantasy and a fiction and a total error have prevailed across time and across borders? It doesn't make any sense. Up until very recently in history, and even now, a lot of people who don't believe in God, be they atheist or agnostic, they still do believe in elements of the unseen to some extent.
Exactly.
They don't totally discount it. So this belief hasn't died out at all. Even amongst the secular community, be they atheist or agnostic, and it's there. It's ubiquitous throughout history and across all of the different zones of the earth.
So another fascinating topic that another avenue that we can open up for later.
Certainly is.
So I think this is it. I think this is where we should conclude our discussion. I believe it was a pleasure to have you on our platform.
Pleasure was mine, bro.
Yeah. So definitely we would love to have you again on our platform, and discuss many other topics with you. And please remember us in your prayers, and we will
vice versa.
Yes. So Jazakallah khairan, and
Wa
assalamu
alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.